Welcome to another long, uneventful, and carefully detailed journey through time. Today, we begin the first installment of a very slow and deeply uneventful history of medieval Europe. We begin with the centuries that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This is Part 1. The Formative Centuries. From the 5th to the 7th century, let us begin slowly. In the year 410, Rome was sacked. The Visigoths, under their leader Alaric, entered the city, looted it, and left. This marked the symbolic end of Roman dominance. In the West, the Western Roman Empire lingered for a few more decades, but it no longer held power or authority. By the year 476, the last emperor of the Western Empire was removed. His name was Romulus Augustulus. He was a child, he ruled in name only. He was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. There was no grand resistance, no imperial revival, only acceptance. What followed was not a collapse, but a transition, a slow, muddy, tedious transition. Germanic kingdoms emerged, not through violent conquest, but through slow settlement. The Ostrogoths took Italy, the Visigoths settled in Hispania, the Franks ruled Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons spread across Britain, the Vandals controlled North Africa. Briefly, each kingdom retained some Roman customs. They spoke Latin, or tried to. They used Roman titles, like Rex and Consul, but the administration decayed. Taxes were no longer collected consistently. Infrastructure went unmaintained. Roman law was slowly replaced by customary tribal codes. The Franks, under Clovis, rose in Gaul. Clovis united Frankish tribes. He converted to Catholic Christianity around the year 500. This gave him legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman Church. He established the Merovingian dynasty. His successors were often minors or puppets. Real power rested in the hands of aristocratic households and the mayor of the palace. The kingdom fragmented repeatedly. It was reunited, then divided again, a pattern that would continue for centuries. In Italy, the Ostrogoths tried to maintain Roman traditions. Their king, Theodoric the Great, ruled wisely. From Ravenna, he preserved Roman law. He employed Roman administrators. He respected the Senate, but his successors were weak. The Byzantine Empire, still powerful in the east, launched a reconquest. Under Emperor Justinian, Justinian ruled from 527 to 565. His general, Belisarius, retook North Africa from the Vandals. Then he invaded Italy. The Gothic War lasted nearly 20 years. Rome changed hands multiple times. The countryside was devastated. Cities were depopulated. Italy was ruined. The dream of Roman reunification died during Justinian's reign. A plague struck. It began in 541. It spread rapidly. It killed thousands every day. In Constantinople, it became known as the Plague of Justinian. The empire's strength was sapped. It never fully recovered. Meanwhile, in Britain, Roman order had vanished. The Anglo-Saxons came in waves. They founded small kingdoms: Kent, Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Northumbria. They spoke early forms of Old English. They practiced pagan religions. They built no cities. They maintained no roads. Roman culture faded in 597. A mission led by Augustine of Canterbury arrived, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. He converted the King of Kent. The process was slow. Full conversion took generations. In Spain, the Visigoths ruled from Toledo. They were originally Arian Christians, a heresy in Catholic eyes. In 589, King Reccardi converted to Catholicism. This unified church and state, but the Visigothic kingdom was politically unstable. Kings were often assassinated. Succession was unclear. Nobles conspired regularly. Nevertheless, some Roman structures survived. Councils of bishops met to make laws. Latin remained the language of administration in the Byzantine East. Emperors continued to rule. They still called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek. They minted coins. They wrote law codes. Justinian's most lasting legacy was his legal compilation, the Corpus Juris Civilis. It preserved Roman legal thought. The Byzantines faced constant war against Persia. In the east, against Slavs and Avars. In the Balkans, against internal revolts. The state was resilient, but overstretched. By the late 7th century, change continued slowly. The Lombards had invaded Italy. In 568, they settled in the north and center. They never conquered all of Italy. The Pope remained in Rome. Semi-independent, the Frankish king still ruled in name, but power continued to drift toward the aristocracy. In England, the Synod of Whitby, in 664, decided the Church would follow Roman practices, not Celtic ones. A small but symbolic event. Monasteries began to flourish. Places like Lindisfarne and Jarrow preserved learning. They copied manuscripts. They grew slowly. In Ireland, monasteries became cultural centers. Irish monks traveled to Europe. They helped reintroduce Latin knowledge. In later centuries, economically, the world had contracted. Trade was minimal. Most people lived in villages. Coinage declined. Barter was common. Social mobility was rare. Life was local and slow. Most people were illiterate. Their world was their village, their fields, their lord, and their priest. Time was measured in seasons, not in years. Politically, Europe was fragmented. No empire, only kingdoms, and within kingdoms. Only regions, and within regions. Only manors, a patchwork of overlapping claims and customs. Yet Christianity spread, and with it came a slow unifying force. Latin, though corrupted, was still used by the Church. Monks wrote, clergy preached. The seeds of future unity were quietly planted in silence. By the year 700, Europe was no longer Roman. It was not yet medieval. It was something in between, a time of formation, of transition, of loss, and slow rebuilding. The foundations had been laid, in stone, in parchment, and in memory. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this extremely slow but gently important journey through the early medieval centuries. In part 2, we will continue into the 8th and 9th centuries, with more slow developments, and even more monasteries. Until then, rest well, and sleep, if you must. The Merovingian dynasty had once ruled Gaul, but by the early 8th century, their kings had become ceremonial, long-haired. Mostly young. Mostly powerless, they issued decrees. But had no armies, they rode in processions. But gave no commands, the real power rested with the mayors of the palace. These were noblemen who ruled in the king's name, but increasingly ruled for themselves. One such man was Charles Martel. Charles Martel held the title mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom. He never claimed to be king, but he acted like one. In 732, Charles led Frankish forces. At the Battle of Tours, they faced Muslim armies from the Umayyad Caliphate, who had crossed into Gaul. From the Iberian Peninsula, Charles won. It was not a large battle, it was not a crusade, but it became symbolic. Later chroniclers saw it as the defense of Christian Europe. Charles earned the name the Hammer. His son, Pepin the Short, took the next step. In 751, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, with papal approval. He was crowned King of the Franks. It was a political deal. In exchange, Pepin granted lands to the Pope. This created the Papal States. Now, the Franks had a new dynasty, the Carolingians, and the Pope had a protector. Pepin ruled until 768. His son was Charles. History remembers him as Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus, or simply Charles the Great. He would become the most powerful man in Western Europe. For centuries, Charlemagne inherited a divided realm. He reunited it, then he expanded it. His wars were numerous and slow. He conquered the Lombards. In Italy, he fought the Saxons. In the east, the Saxon Wars lasted over 30 years. The Saxons resisted. They were pagan. They fought, then submitted, then revolted again. Charlemagne built churches. The Saxons burned them. Charlemagne returned. More battles, more baptisms, more executions. Eventually, the Saxons were subdued, baptized, and taxed. Charlemagne also campaigned in Spain. He supported Christian lords against Muslim rulers, but his campaigns achieved little. One defeat at Roncesvalles in 778 was later mythologized in the Song of Roland, but in truth, it was a minor skirmish. Charlemagne ruled from Aachen. He rarely stayed in one place. He held assemblies, issued decrees, appointed officials. He was not an emperor, not yet, but he acted like one. He sent emissaries called Missi Dominici to inspect provinces. They carried his orders and heard complaints. The Carolingian administration relied on scribes. Laws were copied, land grants recorded. Monasteries became centers of literacy. Latin was preserved, barely. In the year 800, something symbolic happened. Charlemagne visited Rome. Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans. It was Christmas Day, a solemn mass, a golden crown, a title reborn. The Western Roman Empire had fallen over 300 years earlier. Now it returned, sort of. Charlemagne accepted the title cautiously. He was not a Roman, but he ruled an empire. The Byzantines in Constantinople did not approve. They still claimed to be the real Roman Empire. For decades, they refused to recognize Charlemagne's title. Eventually, they did, reluctantly. Charlemagne ruled until 814. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to central Italy. but like all things, it was temporary. Charlemagne's only surviving son was Louis the Pious. He inherited the empire, but he lacked his father's authority. Louis was deeply religious. He preferred prayer to war. He divided the empire among his sons. This created conflict. The empire split, then reunited, then split again, after Louis died in 840. His sons fought. The result was the Treaty of Verdun. In 843, it divided the Carolingian Empire into three parts: West Francia, East Francia, Middle Francia. This treaty shaped future Europe. West Francia would become France, East Francia would become Germany, Middle Francia would disappear into fragments. Meanwhile, outside threats grew. The Vikings began raiding. They came from Scandinavia. They attacked monasteries. They looted towns. They traveled up rivers in longships. The Carolingians were unprepared. They built forts, paid ransoms, prayed. Raids continued for decades. In the south, Muslim forces from Spain raided the Mediterranean coast. In the east, Magyar tribes approached from the steppes. The Carolingian realm was under pressure from all sides. Administratively, the empire grew weaker. Local counts gained more power. Royal authority declined. Charters were forged, laws ignored, allegiances broken. Feudalism began to emerge, not as a system, but as a pattern. Lords gave land to vassals. Vassals pledged loyalty. Peasants worked the land. It was not neat. It was not uniform. It simply happened. Culturally, the Carolingians tried to revive learning. This is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne invited scholars from across Europe: Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, Theodulf of Orleans. They reformed writing. They standardized Latin. They copied ancient texts. A new script emerged: Carolingian minuscule. It was clear, readable, efficient, thanks to it. Many Roman texts survived. Monasteries became libraries. Education was encouraged for clergy and nobility, but most people remained illiterate. By the late 9th century, decline had set in. The empire no longer functioned. Kings ruled in name only. Local lords fought each other. Churchmen built fortresses. Peasants sought protection. The world grew smaller again. And yet, the Carolingians left a legacy. The idea of empire returned. Latin remained. The church grew stronger. The map had changed. Borders had blurred, but something had begun. The 9th century had ended. In disarray, the Carolingian Empire had crumbled. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 had divided the realm. It did not stop there. Further partitions followed. Civil wars, assassinations. Regional lords grew powerful. Kings became figureheads. Vikings still raided. Magyars advanced from the east. Muslim raiders threatened the south. Central authority was weak. Local defense became essential. Power decentralized. This process did not happen quickly. It happened gradually and inconsistently. We call it feudalism, but it was never a formal system. It was a pattern, a response to need, a structure without blueprints. At the heart of it was the fief. A fief was land granted by a lord to a vassal. In return, the vassal pledged loyalty. He offered military service. He offered advice. He sometimes offered money. The agreement was personal. It was sealed by oath, sometimes written, often not. the fief. Could include land, peasants, rights to collect tolls, or to hold courts, the lord. Protected the vassal, the vassal. Served the lord, and so. Society was structured, at the bottom. Were peasants, most were serfs, bound to the land, not quite slaves, but not free, they owed labor, rents, and a portion of their harvest, they needed permission to marry, to travel, to leave, they lived in thatched huts. Ate coarse bread, rarely bathed, their lives were hard and quiet above them. Were knights, not glamorous, not noble, not yet knighthood. Was a function, a profession, knights were warriors, they served lords, they trained from childhood, they learned to fight, ride horses, and obey orders, they received small fiefs, and hoped for more, above knights. Were nobles, counts, dukes, margraves, barons, their titles varied, their power depended on land, some controlled large regions, others held only a few villages, they built castles, mostly stone, some wooden. Castles were not luxurious, they were fortresses, cold, cramped, defensive, above the nobles. Was the king, in name, the highest authority, in practice. Often powerless, in West Francia. Royal authority dwindled, in 987. The last Carolingian king died, the nobles elected Hugh Capet, he ruled around Paris, he founded the Capetian dynasty, but his real control was small, the kingship was weak, his vassals were stronger, France was a patchwork, in East Francia. The story was different, there. A new dynasty rose, the Ottonians, in 962. Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, it was a revival, of Charlemagne's legacy, but more symbolic than powerful. The Holy Roman Empire included German lands, and northern Italy, but it was not united, the emperor had prestige, but local dukes held real power, in England. A different pattern formed, after centuries of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Viking invasions resumed, in the late 9th century, King Alfred of Wessex resisted, he built fortresses, promoted learning, encouraged translations, his successors reconquered territory, in 927. England became unified, but in 1016. It was conquered again, by King Nut. A Dane, a Danish king, ruled over Englishmen, in 1042. The Anglo-Saxon line returned, but its days were numbered, in Scandinavia. Vikings continued to raid, but also settled. In 911, a Viking leader, Rollo, was granted land in northern France, this became Normandy, the Normans became Christian, adopted French, became feudal lords, elsewhere. Scandinavia slowly converted, kings emerged, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, but unity was fragile, in Central Europe. The Magyars raided, they were horsemen. From the steppes, they attacked towns, churches, monasteries, in 955. At the Battle of Lechfeld, Otto I defeated them, the raids stopped, the Magyars settled, they became Christian, they formed the Kingdom of Hungary. In 1000. In the south, Muslim powers controlled parts of Iberia, the Caliphate of Cordoba flourished, it was rich, urbanized, cosmopolitan, Christian kingdoms survived in the north, Navarre, Asturias, Leon, Castile, they began a slow process, called the Reconquista, it would take centuries, in Italy. Fragmentation continued, northern cities grew in power, southern Italy saw conflict, Lombards, Byzantines, Muslims, Normans, the Pope ruled Rome, often besieged, often negotiating. The church was a growing force. Monasteries multiplied, especially under the rule of Saint Benedict. Benedictine monks lived simple lives: prayer, work, reading. Monasteries preserved texts, tilled land, offered charity. The Cluniac reforms began in 910, at Cluny, in Burgundy. Monks emphasized purity, strict adherence, no interference from lords. The movement spread. The church sought independence from secular power. This tension would grow. Education was rare, limited to clergy. Books were expensive, written by hand, copied slowly. Libraries were small. Most people could not read, but Latin endured. Society was static. Sons inherited land, daughters married for alliance, lords held courts, settled disputes. Justice was personal, based on oaths, compurgation, trial by ordeal. There were no police, no central enforcement, only honor and power. In cities, trade revived slowly, markets formed, towns grew, but most people remained rural. Merchants were few, artisans lived modestly. Towns had walls, but little comfort. Sanitation was poor, disease common. Life was short, hard, predictable, and yet change stirred. The year 1000 came and passed. With no apocalypse, people began to build more churches. Stone architecture returned. The Romanesque style appeared. Thick walls, round arches, small windows. It was the beginning of something new. We begin. In the 11th century, Europe had survived the year 1000. There was no apocalypse, no end of days, no divine punishment. Life continued, slowly and painfully, but change was underway. Some noticed the corruption within the church. Simony was common, that is, the buying and selling of church offices. Clerical marriage was widespread. Priests had wives, some had children, many ignored the ideal of celibacy. Lay rulers appointed bishops, even abbots. It was called lay investiture. Secular leaders gave spiritual authority. This disturbed reformers. They wanted change. At the center was the monastery of Cluny, founded in 910. It had no secular overlord. Only the Pope. Cluniac monks emphasized prayer, discipline, purity. Their influence grew. Soon, new monasteries followed their example. This was the beginning of the Gregorian reform movement, named not after Pope Gregory I, but after Pope Gregory VII. He reigned from 1073 to 1085. Gregory VII was determined to purify the church. He opposed simony. He demanded clerical celibacy, and most of all, he opposed lay investiture. He issued a document called the Dictatus Papae. It claimed the Pope had power over all kings. It stated that the Pope could depose emperors. This caused conflict, especially with Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. This led to the investiture controversy, a power struggle between church and state. In 1076, Henry IV declared Gregory deposed. Gregory excommunicated Henry. Excommunication meant exclusion from the church, from the sacraments, from salvation. Nobles rebelled. Henry was forced to seek forgiveness. In 1077, he traveled to Canossa, in the snow, to the castle of Matilda of Tuscany. There, he stood barefoot for 3 days. Eventually, Gregory forgave him, but the struggle continued. Pope and emperor each claimed supremacy. The church was no longer subordinate. The church was no longer subordinate. It asserted independence. It claimed universal authority. Meanwhile, The papacy strengthened, new orders arose, the Cistercians. Founded in 1098, emphasized simplicity, they rejected the wealth and ceremony of Cluny, they built austere monasteries, they wore undyed robes, they worked in silence, monastic life was expanding, new communities, new rules, new disciplines. At the same time, pilgrimage increased, holy sites drew thousands, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem. Pilgrims traveled for months, some for years. They wore badges, carried staffs, slept in barns, ate bread and beans. It was spiritual, also difficult. Jerusalem was under Muslim rule for centuries. Christian pilgrims had been allowed, but tensions rose. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantine army at Manzikert. This alarmed the east. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, appealed to the west for help. Pope Urban II responded. In 1095, at Clermont in France, he gave a sermon. He called upon the knights of Christendom to take up arms, to march to the east, to free the Holy Land, to aid the Byzantines, to save Jerusalem. He offered remission of sins. He shouted, Deus vult, God wills it. The First Crusade had begun. People responded with fervor. Knights, peasants, clerics, sailors, whole communities joined. There were preaching tours, charters, crosses sewn on garments. This was not just war, it was a pilgrimage with swords. Many were unprepared. In 1096, the People's Crusade departed, led by Peter the Hermit, a preacher, charismatic, not trained in war. Thousands followed him, mostly peasants. They marched through Germany, Hungary, the Balkans. Some groups attacked Jews, especially in the Rhineland. Massacres occurred, thousands of Jews were killed. Church officials condemned it, but it happened. The People's Crusade reached Anatolia. There, they were destroyed by the Turks. Then came the Prince's Crusade, led by nobles, organized, armed. Notable leaders included Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Baldwin of Boulogne. They departed in 1096, and arrived in Constantinople in 1097. The Byzantines were cautious. They extracted oaths, promises to return land. The Crusaders advanced into Anatolia. They took Nicaea, then Dorylaeum, then Antioch. After a long siege, they suffered famine, disease, desertion. Finally, in 1099, they reached Jerusalem. The city was fortified, defended by Fatimid troops. The siege was brutal. In July 1099, the walls were breached. The Crusaders entered. They massacred the inhabitants, Muslims, Jews, even Christians. The city ran red, but they had succeeded. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The Crusaders established 4 states: 1. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, 2. The County of Tripoli, 3. The Principality of Antioch, 4. The County of Edessa. They built castles, governed the land, interacted with locals, sometimes peacefully, often not. These states relied on aid, on trade, on constant reinforcements. They were fragile, but for now they stood. The First Crusade had consequences. The Church gained prestige. The Pope became a war leader. Knights saw a new purpose. War became sacred. New orders formed: the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, militant monks, sworn to poverty and to battle. Commerce increased, routes to the east opened. Italy's maritime cities benefited: Venice, Genoa, Pisa. Ideas traveled, goods moved, contacts with the Muslim world expanded. Knowledge also flowed: medicine, mathematics, astronomy. But mistrust grew between East and West, Christian and Muslim. Christian and Jew, the Crusades would continue for 2 more centuries. The 12th century was not a sudden transformation, it was gradual, tedious, incremental, but it mattered. By now, Europe had stabilized, populations grew, towns developed, trade resumed, kings, once weak and fragmented, began to assert their power. They faced many obstacles: feudal lords, independent nobles, ecclesiastical authorities, customary law, but step by step, the foundations of monarchy were laid. Let us first consider England. In 1066, as you may recall, William the Conqueror took the English throne, a Norman, from France. He brought with him new systems, castles, French aristocracy, a centralized royal court. His descendants continued this consolidation. Henry II reigned from 1154 to 1189, a powerful king, founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. He ruled not just England, but vast territories in France, Angevin lands, stretching from Normandy to Aquitaine. This was called the Angevin Empire. He introduced reforms, strengthened royal justice, royal courts expanded, common law developed. It was slow, but systematic. He clashed with the church, most notably with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their dispute over clerical rights ended in 1170, when Becket was murdered in a cathedral. The event shocked Christendom. Henry faced penance, but the monarchy continued to grow. Henry's sons included Richard the Lionheart and John. Richard went on crusade. He barely ruled in England. John was less heroic. He lost most French territories, and in 1215, after disputes with barons, he was forced to sign the Magna Carta. This document limited royal authority. It established that the king was not above the law. It guaranteed rights to the nobility and laid groundwork for English constitutional development. It was reissued multiple times, often ignored, but symbolically important. Now we turn to France. The Capetian dynasty had ruled since 987, but early kings controlled little, mostly around Paris, called the Isle de France. Feudal lords were powerful, but the Capetians played the long game. Each king crowned his son during his own lifetime. This ensured smooth succession. Gradually, they expanded control. Philip II Augustus ruled from 1180 to 1223. He took Normandy from King John of England. He reorganized administration. He appointed officials called bailies and seneschaux. They collected taxes, administered justice, reported to the crown. This bypassed nobles. Philip was methodical. He increased royal revenues, built a standing army. He also joined the Third Crusade, but his legacy was territorial expansion and stronger monarchy. His grandson, Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis, ruled from 1226 to 1270. He was pious, just, popular. He banned private warfare, reformed currency, built hospitals. He held public audiences under a tree to hear complaints. He participated in crusades and died in Tunisia. He was later canonized, a king who became a saint. His reign symbolized the moral ideal of kingship. Under him, French monarchy gained prestige. Now to the Holy Roman Empire, a complex entity, neither holy, nor Roman, nor a centralized empire. It stretched across modern Germany, Austria, Switzerland, parts of Italy. The emperor was elected by prince-electors. He had to manage diverse lands, languages, customs. Central authority was weak. In the 12th century, the Hohenstaufen dynasty rose. Frederick I Barbarossa ruled from 1155 to 1190. He sought to restore imperial authority. He fought in Italy, tried to control the cities, especially Milan. and the Lombard League, but resistance was strong. He negotiated with the papacy, participated in the Crusades. He drowned in a river on the way to the Holy Land. His legacy was ambition and complexity. His grandson, Frederick II. In Spain, the Reconquista continued. Christian kingdoms in the north gradually pushed southward. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Leon. They fought against the Muslims. In Al-Andalus, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, in 1212, was a turning point. Christian armies defeated the Almohads. Territories expanded. Kings used law codes, encouraged repopulation, created town charters, but unity was still far off. Spain remained divided. In Scandinavia, monarchies also emerged. In Denmark, King Valdemar I and his successors expanded royal power. In Norway, Harald Gilles' descendants eventually consolidated rule. In Sweden, kings ruled unevenly due to strong noble clans. But Christianity spread. Kings adopted European customs. Written laws appeared. Slow consolidation. Few castles. Harsh winters. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, Poland fractured into duchies. Hungary strengthened under Bela III. Bohemia gained prestige within the empire. In the Balkans, Byzantine influence waned. New kingdoms rose. Serbia, Bulgaria, the Mongols would arrive soon, but for now, monarchies stood on fragile legs. Throughout Europe, monarchs expanded authority. They used law, coinage, charters, marriage alliances. They built castles, held court, granted privileges. They negotiated more than they fought. They relied on scribes, records, seals. A new class emerged, administrators, often trained in canon law, educated in cathedral schools, not nobles, not warriors, but useful. The rise of bureaucracy was slow, but steady. By the year 1100, Europe had rested. For nearly a century, after the early medieval storms, raids had subsided. Vikings stayed in Scandinavia, Magyars settled in Hungary, Saracen pirates no longer harried coasts. Stability allowed for change. Populations grew, very slowly, and then a bit faster. Cleared forests, drained marshes, reclaimed land, often with great monotony. New fields appeared, so did villages, and slowly, the towns returned. These towns were often built atop ancient ruins, the bones of old Roman cities. Walls crumbled, stones reused, foundations re-excavated. They started small, a market square, a church, a few workshops, traveling merchants, wandering clerics, peasants seeking opportunity. Over decades, they grew. Some towns received charters. These were documents issued by kings, or bishops, or lords. They granted privileges, market rights, tax exemptions, legal protections. In return, townspeople paid fees, and sometimes built walls. Chartered towns became communes, self-governing, with elected councils, or even mayors. But power was often shared with lords and bishops. Disputes were common, but not always exciting. Now let us consider the structure of towns. Streets were narrow, often muddy. Houses of timber leaned outward. Upper stories loomed over cobbled lanes. Shops faced the streets. Living quarters above. Smells of tanning leather mingled with the scent of baking bread and unwashed humanity. At the center stood the market. Covered stalls, open carts, bales of wool, jugs of wine, bundles of herbs, and noise, low, constant, echoing. Trade resumed, but slowly. Local trade came first. Towns exchanged goods with nearby villages, wheat for cloth, tools for meat, salt for hides. Then regional trade, across rivers, over hills. Pack animals carried goods. Later, carts, and, eventually, Wagons, merchant associations formed, they traveled in groups, for safety. Robbers still lingered. By the 13th century, long-distance trade revived. Italian cities led the way: Venice, Genoa, Pisa. They sailed the Mediterranean, imported silks, spices, and glass from Byzantium and the Islamic world. They traded with Egypt, with Constantinople, even with the Mongol Empire. Their ships grew larger: galleys, cogs, merchant fleets, escorted by armed escorts. They brought luxury goods and coins, lots of coins. In the north, another league formed, the Hanseatic League. German towns along the Baltic Sea, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Riga, Gdansk. They traded fish, grain, furs, timber. Their ships were sturdy. They dominated trade in the cold northern waters. Their offices, called counters, appeared in other cities: London, Bruges, Novgorod. Their meetings were long and bureaucratic, but effective. As trade grew, so did guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants. They regulated work, set prices, trained apprentices. Each craft had a guild: weavers, tanners, butchers, goldsmiths, bakers. Guilds protected standards and monopolies. Only guild members could sell. Within town limits, they held processions, celebrated feast days, funded chapels. They were powerful, sometimes more than the town council. Money changed, coinage increased. Kings minted silver pennies, some minted gold. Counting houses appeared. Money changers, early banks. Italian families like the Medici would later dominate banking, but now it was simple lending: receipts, tally sticks, letters of credit. Merchants carried ledgers and scales, transactions recorded by scribes on parchment, filed away, often forgotten. Education revived because of trade. Merchants needed literacy, so did officials. Town-sponsored schools taught Latin, basic accounting, legal terms. Some grew into universities: Bologna, for law; Paris, for theology; Oxford and Cambridge. In England, students arrived from all over Europe. They wore robes, studied Aristotle, debated in Latin, lived poorly. Lectures were long, dry, monotonous, perfect for this channel. Now let us speak of urban society. Towns had layers. At the top, wealthy merchants, then guild masters, next journeymen, then apprentices, and below, the laborers, the poor, the beggars. Some towns had minorities. Jews lived in many cities. They lent money, faced restrictions, sometimes expulsions. They lived in quarters, separate, protected, or targeted. Towns faced problems. Fires were common. Timber houses burned easily. Water was scarce. Wells polluted. Waste dumped in streets. Disease spread quickly. Even before the plague, law enforcement was minimal. Watchmen rang bells, but crime persisted. Still, people came. Towns offered opportunity, escape from feudal dues, a chance at wealth, or at least freedom. The saying went, town air makes you free. If a runaway serf lived in town for a year and a day, he became free. This changed society, gradually, irreversibly. By the 14th century, some towns grew large: Florence, Paris, Ghent, Bruges, tens of thousands, even 100,000. But most remained small, few comforts, few rights, but they mattered. Urban life was back, and it would never disappear again. Let us now conclude. The period from the 12th to the 14th century saw towns rise, trade revive, guilds form, markets buzz, and coins circulate, all slowly, all steadily, the quiet heartbeat of a changing world. The rural gave way to the urban, and under it all, the foundations of capitalism, were quietly laid. The century began, as many others do, with expectations. In the early 1300s, Europe's population had grown, fields were full, towns were busy, trade routes extended, monarchies solidified, but the growth was fragile, built upon narrow margins, and the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period ended, a cooler phase began. The Little Ice Age reigns. Came long persistent, cold rains, harvests failed again and again. The years 1315 to 1317 are known as the Great Famine. In northern Europe, crop yields dropped, wheat rotted in fields, hay failed, cattle died, prices soared, people could not afford bread. Famine followed, slow, creeping, and inescapable. Chroniclers wrote of people eating dogs, cats, even dirt. Some rumors speak of cannibalism, though such tales may be exaggerated, they reflect despair. This famine did not kill like war, it killed quietly, through malnutrition, weakness, and disease. Infants died, the elderly perished, the poor disappeared. Some estimated 10 to 15% of affected regions lost their population. The social fabric began to tear, but famine was only the beginning. As the century progressed, conflict increased, most notably between two kingdoms, England and France. Their quarrel became the 100 Years' War. It did not last 100 years, but rather a series of campaigns. Between 1337 and 1453, we will cover it, only in part, today. It began with a claim. The English king, Edward III, claimed the French crown. The French disagreed. War began, naval raids, sieges, cavalry charges, but warfare was sporadic and destructive. Armies lived off the land, pillaged villages, burned crops. Civilians suffered most. Fields were abandoned, towns sacked, merchants avoided roads. War bred instability, and then came the plague, the Black Death. In 1347, a ship arrived in Sicily. Its sailors were sick and dying. The disease spread, silently, swiftly, invisibly. The century began, as many others do, with expectations. In the early 1300s, Europe's population had grown, fields were full, towns were busy, trade routes extended, monarchies solidified, but the growth was fragile, built upon narrow margins, and the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period ended, a cooler phase began. The Little Ice Age reigns. Came long persistent, cold rains, harvests failed again and again. The years 1315 to 1317 are known as the Great Famine. In northern Europe, crop yields dropped, wheat rotted in fields, hay failed, cattle died, prices soared, people could not afford bread. Famine followed, slow, creeping, and inescapable. Chroniclers wrote of people eating dogs, cats, even dirt. Some rumors speak of cannibalism, though such tales may be exaggerated, they reflect despair. This famine did not kill like war, it killed quietly, through malnutrition, weakness, and disease. Infants died, the elderly perished, the poor disappeared. Some estimated 10 to 15% of affected regions lost their population. The social fabric began to tear, but famine was only the beginning. As the century progressed, conflict increased, most notably between two kingdoms, England and France. Their quarrel became the 100 Years' War. It did not last 100 years, but rather a series of campaigns. Between 1337 and 1453, we will cover it, only in part, today. It began with a claim. The English king, Edward III, claimed the French crown. The French disagreed. War began, naval raids, sieges, cavalry charges. But warfare was sporadic and destructive. Armies lived off the land, pillaged villages, burned crops. Civilians suffered most. Fields were abandoned, towns sacked, merchants avoided roads. War bred instability, and then came the plague, the Black Death. In 1347, a ship arrived in Sicily. Its sailors were sick and dying. The disease spread, silently, swiftly, invisibly. The century began, as many others do, with expectations. In the early 1300s, Europe's population had grown, fields were full, towns were busy, trade routes extended, monarchies solidified, but the growth was fragile, built upon narrow margins, and the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period ended, a cooler phase began. The Little Ice Age. Rains came, long persistent, cold rains. Harvests failed, again and again. The years 1315 to 1317 are known as the Great Famine. In Northern Europe, crop yields dropped, wheat rotted in fields, hay failed, cattle died, prices soared, people could not afford bread. Famine followed, slow, creeping, and inescapable. Chroniclers wrote of people eating dogs, cats, even dirt. Some rumors speak of cannibalism. Though such tales may be exaggerated, they reflect despair. This famine did not kill like war, it killed quietly, through malnutrition, weakness, and disease. Infants died, the elderly perished, the poor disappeared. Some estimated 10 to 15% of affected regions lost their population. The social fabric began to tear, but famine was only the beginning. As the century progressed, conflict increased, most notably between two kingdoms, England and France. Their quarrel became the 100 Years' War. It did not last 100 years, but rather a series of campaigns. Between 1337 and 1453, we will cover it only in part today. It began with a claim. The English king, Edward III, claimed the French crown. The French disagreed. War began, naval raids, sieges, cavalry charges. But warfare was sporadic and destructive. Armies lived off the land, pillaged villages, burned crops. Civilians suffered most. Fields were abandoned, towns sacked, merchants avoided roads. War bred instability, and then came the plague, the Black Death. In 1347, a ship arrived in Sicily. Its sailors were sick and dying. The disease spread, silently, swiftly, invisibly, by one. By 1348, it reached France, then England, Germany, Scandinavia. No region was spared. It came in waves, fever, swelling, bleeding, and death, often within days. Historians now know it was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas, on rats. But medieval people did not know this. They blamed bad air, comets, God's wrath, Jews, witches, the stars. Physicians were helpless. Priests were overwhelmed. Grave diggers could not keep pace. Mass graves were dug. In some towns, half the population died. In others, more. Across Europe, it is estimated 30 to 50% of the population perished. The consequences were immense. Fields lay fallow, workers vanished, prices fluctuated, wages rose, labor became scarce, serfs demanded freedom, tensions rose between lords and peasants, guilds lost members, new ones formed, the church struggled, many clergy died. Those who remained could not explain the suffering. Confidence declined, pilgrimages increased, so did mysticism. flagellant movements emerged, groups who whipped themselves. To appease God, they marched through towns, chanting, bleeding, spreading fear, and sometimes, plague. Scapegoats were sought. In many cities, Jewish communities were blamed, accused of poisoning wells, of sorcery, of secret plots. Pogroms followed, Jews were expelled, killed, forced to convert. It was not rational, but fear rarely is. This deepened divisions and scarred memory. Social unrest followed. As the plague waned, society reeled. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler, fueled by high taxes and labor laws, the rebels marched on London, killed officials, demanded reforms. The king met them, promised concessions, then betrayed them. Tyler was killed, the revolt crushed, but it was not forgotten. Other revolts occurred. In France, the Jacquerie, in 1358, a rebellion of peasants, against taxes, and noble cruelty. It too was crushed, but it showed the strain. In Flanders, urban revolts. In Florence, a rising of wool workers. The 14th century was not stable, it trembled. Even the church was divided. From 1309 to 1377, the Pope resided in Avignon, not Rome. Known as the Avignon Papacy, 7 popes ruled from France. Critics called them corrupt, worldly, too close to French kings. Then, in 1378, a schism, 1 pope in Rome, another in Avignon, the Great Western Schism, 2 popes, sometimes 3, Christendom divided, councils met, argued, issued decrees, unity came, but not until 1417, the church's prestige never fully recovered, and yet, amid the crisis, life continued. Books were copied, cathedrals expanded, merchants traded, families were raised, art changed, painters depicted death, skeletons, judgment scenes, the danse macabre, the dance of death, a reminder that no one escapes, not king, nor priest, nor peasant. Let us now summarize. The 14th century was a period of crisis. It began with rain, famine, then war, then plague, then revolt, then schism. But from crisis came change. Feudalism weakened, labor gained value, town life adapted, the church was questioned. Europe did not collapse, it endured, and began to shift towards something new, towards something different. Not a leap, not a spark, but a quiet shift, a gradual unfolding, a slow dawn. After a long medieval night, the Renaissance begins, but not yet in full. Today we explore its early stirrings. From 1350 to 1450, the word Renaissance means rebirth, but rebirth requires a death, and the 14th century gave Europe many: death of feudal ties, death of certainty, death of stability. What followed was not immediate change, but slow transformation. It began in cities, especially in Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome. Urban life, stimulated by trade, patronage, and memory of Rome, of Latin, of sculptures in ruins, of manuscripts in dust. In Florence, a banker's son named Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch, read old texts. He admired Cicero, copied Virgil, disdained the ignorance of his age. He called the centuries after Rome's fall the Dark Ages. He longed for clarity, for beauty, for eloquence. And so began humanism. Humanism was not atheism, it was not rebellion. It was a shift in focus, from God alone to man as well, from heaven to earth, from the cloister to the forum. Humanists read Latin, not for salvation, but for wisdom, style, virtue. They wrote letters, essays, dialogues. They founded schools, copied manuscripts, corrected errors, they studied grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, moral philosophy, the studia humanitatis, manuscripts, became objects of desire, libraries grew, collectors paid scribes, monks became copyists, then, a change in medium, from parchment, to paper, cheaper, thinner, imported from the Islamic world. Ideas spread faster, and in the mid-1400s, one man would change everything. We will reach him soon, but first, the painters. In Florence, around 1400, a young man painted frescoes, his name, Masaccio, his work, in the Brancacci chapel, figures stood in space. Cast shadows, expressed sorrow, perspective was born, not fully, but visibly, lines converged, depth emerged, viewers could enter the scene. At the same time, a sculptor shaped marble, Donatello, his statue of David, stood naked, young, victorious, the first freestanding nude since antiquity, not medieval, not symbolic, but human, vulnerable, real. Architecture changed too. Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith and engineer, designed a dome for Florence's cathedral, a dome that should have been impossible. He studied Roman ruins, devised hoists, used herringbone brick patterns. In 1436, the dome was completed, majestic, mathematical, modern. Why Florence? Because Florence was rich, its economy rested on wool, banking, and trade. The Medici family, wealthy bankers, funded artists, commissioned chapels, paid scholars. Their wealth enabled beauty, their taste shaped a city, their power lay not in armies, but in patronage. Lorenzo de' Medici would become known as Il Magnifico, but we are not there yet. Elsewhere in Italy, change spread slowly. In Venice, painters favored color, light, softness. In Padua, a man named Giotto had already painted with emotion. His figures wept, bent, embraced. It was the beginning of realism. In literature, another figure emerged, Giovanni Boccaccio. He wrote the Decameron. 10 young people flee the Black Death and tell stories, stories of wit, desire, greed, folly. Not saints, not martyrs, but people, laughing, scheming, living. It was bold and human. Politics, too, shifted. In Milan, the Visconti and Sforza families ruled. In Naples, the Angevins competed with the Aragonese. In Rome, the papacy returned from Avignon, but the church was fractured. After the Great Schism, councils tried to reform. One such council, in Constance, ended the schism, but not the doubts. The Renaissance was not peace. Italy saw wars, city-states fought each other, mercenaries, condottieri, sold violence. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, Rome, they formed alliances, broke them, fought again, but war did not stop art. In fact, it funded it. Victories required celebration, palaces, paintings, pageants, and now, we return to the north, beyond the Alps. There, too, changes brewed. In France, recovery from war and plague. In England, the Lollards questioned church authority. In the Holy Roman Empire, fragmentation remained. In Bohemia, a preacher named Jan Hus called for reform. He was burned, but his followers rose. The Hussite Wars followed, a prelude to the Reformation. But ideas needed tools, and in Mainz, Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg crafted one, the printing press, movable type, ink, paper, press. Around 1450, he printed the Gutenberg Bible. Books would never again be the same. Knowledge would multiply, and humanism would explode. Let us pause. The years from 1350 to 1450 did not produce the high Renaissance, not yet, but they planted seeds, in art, in thought, in form, in faith, the world did not change overnight, it shifted, in quiet ways. In cities, in minds, in studios, and in scripts, this is the High Renaissance, the time when minds and hands aligned, when cities patronized genius, when paint, marble, and ink told stories not of saints alone, but of mankind. We begin in Florence, still Florence, but not for long. The center soon shifts. First, we meet Leonardo, born 1452, in Vinci, a bastard child. Apprentice to Verrocchio, he painted, he designed, he dissected, he observed. His notebooks overflow with diagrams, thoughts, wonders. He painted the Last Supper, mural in Milan, Christ, and 12 apostles, captured, in one moment, one gesture, one breath. Then he painted La Gioconda, also known as the Mona Lisa, a smile that fades and returns, a gaze that does not blink. Then there was Michelangelo, born in 1475, a sculptor, painter, architect, poet. He carved the David, not a boy, but a man, tense, noble, ready. He painted the Sistine Chapel, a ceiling of stories. God creates Adam, fingers almost touching. He also carved the Pieta. Mary holding her son, still, resigned, endless sadness, in still stone. Third, Raphael, born in 1483, died in 1520, a short life, a full one. He painted the school of Athens, a gathering of minds, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, all under one dome, a harmony of thought, perspective, balance. These three, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, form a triangle, each side, a master. Florence could not contain them. The center shifted to Rome. In Rome, the papacy rebuilt, under Pope Julius II, then Leo X. They hired artists, commissioned palaces, expanded St. Peter's Basilica. Art became propaganda, God, and glory, and grandeur, but always beauty. Outside Italy, change unfolded differently. In the north, less marble, more wood, less myth, more detail. In Flanders, Jan van Eyck painted with oil. He painted the Arnolfini portrait, a marriage, a mirror, a dog, so much, so still. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer drew with precision. He traveled to Italy, learned perspective, returned north, mixed styles. His prints spread widely, woodcuts, engravings, portable genius. In the Netherlands, Hieronymus Bosch painted nightmares. The Garden of Earthly Delights, the triptych, sin, pleasure, punishment, surreal, frightening, modern. Alongside art came thought. The printing press now spread ideas, books multiplied, texts traveled. In Rotterdam, a scholar wrote in Latin. Desiderius Erasmus, a humanist, a reformer, a critic. He wrote in praise of folly, satirical, clever, sharp. He edited the Greek New Testament, sought clarity, not revolution, but reason. Universities grew, scholars debated, languages evolved. In England, Thomas More imagined utopia, an island of laws, of reason, of order. In France, Montaigne would soon write essays, but not yet. The North valued calm, order, piety, and quiet resistance, but storm clouds gathered, not in art, but in faith. In Germany, a monk grew troubled. He saw indulgences, corruption, excess. His name, Martin Luther. He wrote 95 Theses, but that is for another time. This is the Reformation. It begins in the early 16th century. It will end, not quickly, not cleanly. The year is 1517. A German monk, named Martin Luther, walks through the small town of Wittenberg. He carries a parchment, nailed to a church door, were 95 Theses, 95 questions, objections, critiques, his target, indulgences. These were payments, donations, coins for sins, in exchange for time, reduced in purgatory. The Church approved. Luther disagreed. Luther believed in faith alone, Scripture alone, grace alone, not relics, not rituals, not Rome. He did not seek rebellion. At first, he sought discussion, but his word spread quickly, by printing press, by pamphlet, by mouth. In 1521, he was summoned to Worms, a diet, not of food, but of judgment. There, he refused to recant. He was condemned, declared an outlaw, protected by princes. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of over 300 entities, was ripe for division. Some rulers embraced Luther, not always from faith, but from politics, to resist Rome, to keep taxes, to centralize power. Thus began Lutheranism, not as a single church, but as many, unified by text, by translation. Luther translated the Bible into German. It spread to towns, to homes, to minds. Others followed. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli preached reform in Zurich. No images, no masses, no saints, only the Word. Then, John Calvin, in Geneva, he taught predestination, that God had chosen the saved and the damned before time. His church was strict, disciplined, moral, dancing banned, gambling punished. But his writings spread widely. The institutes of the Christian religion became a guide. In England, reform came differently. Henry VIII wanted a divorce. Rome said no. Henry said yes. In 1534, he passed the Act of Supremacy. He became head of the Church of England, not the Pope. The English Reformation was political first, then religious. Monasteries were dissolved, property seized. Later, Edward VI turned more Protestant. Mary I reversed it. Elizabeth I balanced both. The Anglican Church emerged, neither fully Catholic, nor fully Protestant. The Reformation was not peaceful, it bred conflict. In Germany, war broke out, the Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, inspired by reform, but crushed by lords. In France, Catholics and Huguenots fought. Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, 1572, thousands killed. In the Netherlands, Protestants revolted against Catholic Spain, war of religion and independence. It lasted 80 years. In Scotland, John Knox spread Calvinism. Presbyterians took shape. In Poland, Bohemian Brethren and Unitarians debated doctrine. Even in Italy, reform stirred, then was silenced. The Inquisition returned. Books were banned, thoughts policed. The Catholic Church responded with its own reforms. This was the Counter-Reformation. It began slowly, then grew firm. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, doctrines reaffirmed, errors corrected, corruption addressed, but not concessions. Faith and works, scripture and tradition, 7 sacraments, all reaffirmed. New orders formed. The Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, in 1540, disciplined, educated, global, they spread Catholicism to Asia, Africa, the Americas. Art also responded. Baroque emerged, dramatic, emotional, spiritual. Churches became theaters of faith. Light pierced shadows, figures reached upward. In Rome, Caravaggio painted saints, with dirt on their feet. In Spain, El Greco distorted forms, to lift the soul. Music followed. Palestrina composed for clarity. The senses were enlisted. Meanwhile, Europe fractured, no longer one church, but many, divided by belief, by geography, by politics. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555, offered a rule, cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, but only for Catholics and Lutherans. Others were left out. tension simmered. This was not the end. The Reformation would echo, in wars, in migrations, in the shaping of nations. But we pause here. From 1517 to 1600, Christendom splintered, not all at once, but steadily, like ice, cracking slowly across a lake. Faith turned inward, outward, divisive, but also more personal. No longer one voice, but many. Some shouted, some whispered. All changed Europe forever. It began in Portugal, a small kingdom facing the Atlantic. A prince called Henry the Navigator, though he never sailed, he sent ships to explore, to chart, to measure. His goal: find a route to India by sea, by sailing south along Africa's coast. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut, in India. He returned with spices, cloves, cinnamon, pepper. Profits were high, the route was open, but Spain looked west. Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor, under Spanish flag, sought Asia. By going west, he left in 1492, with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. He reached islands, the Caribbean. He thought it was Asia. It was not. He returned, with stories, and gold, and captives. Spain was pleased. The world needed rules. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the globe. Spain got the west, Portugal, the east, an imaginary line. On real oceans, the map was drawn, before it was known. Then came empires. In 1519, Hernán Cortés sailed to Mexico. There stood Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, a city of canals, temples, markets. But Cortés, with few men, and many allies, brought it down: guns, steel, horses, and disease. In 1533, Francisco Pizarro reached Peru. He met the Inca Empire. He too conquered. Gold flowed to Spain, so did silver, especially from Potosí, a mountain of metal, mined at great cost. In Brazil, Portugal planted sugar, cut forests, built mills. Demand grew, labor was needed. So began the Atlantic slave trade. Millions, taken from Africa, packed into ships, chained, dehumanized, transported, sold. A triangle of trade. Europe sent goods, Africa sent people. The Americas sent crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton. An economic cycle, a human tragedy. In the east, Portugal took ports, Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Macau in China. They traded spices, silk, porcelain. They built forts, converted locals, but faced resistance. The Ottomans in the Red Sea, the Mughals in India, the Chinese in the South China Sea. Trade was possible, dominance was not guaranteed. Spain looked across the Pacific. In 1565, they founded Manila. In the Philippines, a Spanish port. In Asia, they brought silver from Mexico, traded it for Chinese goods, a global link. East met West, through coins. The first true world economy began. England, late to the game, entered in the 16th century. John Cabot explored North America, briefly. Later, Francis Drake sailed around the world. He raided Spanish ships, collected gold, claimed coasts. England began to settle. In 1607, Jamestown was founded, a colony, a foothold. France too explored. Jacques Cartier sailed the St. Lawrence. Later, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec. The French traded furs, made alliances, often with less conquest than Spain or Portugal. The Dutch founded the Dutch East India Company. In 1602, a trading empire, privately owned, backed by state. They took Batavia, dominated spice trade, challenged Portugal. In the Americas, they settled New Amsterdam, later known as New York. They were traders, efficient, ruthless. Maps improved, ships grew stronger, navigation advanced, the astrolabe, the quadrant, the caravel, winds were charted, currents understood, the Atlantic was crossed, routinely, but with conquest, came consequences. For native peoples, population collapse, due to disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, cultures lost, languages silenced. For Europe, wealth, conflict, competition. For Africa, a century of loss, of people, of peace. This era was not discovery, not really, others lived there, already. It was encounter, collision, transformation, and it was global. The 17th century, a time of kings and queens, of thrones, of power. But what is power? Is it wealth? Is it armies? Is it the ability to command? Perhaps. But in this time, power was something else. It was absolute. A king, with absolute sovereignty, could do anything, nothing, and no one could stand in his way. It was a world where the architecture of power was visible in the very walls that surrounded them. The century begins with the rise of monarchs, kings who ruled by divine right, that is. They ruled because God had chosen them. They were not accountable to their people, nor to anyone, but God. The idea of absolute monarchy was not new, but it was now more pronounced, more refined. In France, the most famous example is Louis XIV. He ruled from 1643 until 1715, known as the Sun King. Louis believed that his power came from God, and he exercised it with no limits. He built a grand palace at Versailles, a palace that became the symbol of his reign. It was enormous, filled with luxury, with grandeur, but it was not just a home, it was a tool of power. At Versailles, the king did not just rule. He was the state. His ministers, his courtiers, all lived within his sight, their actions, controlled by his presence. Versailles was designed to control. Its gardens were vast, its rooms, endless. It was a palace of order, of display. Here, the king could remind his nobles that they were his subjects, not the other way around. Noblemen would spend hours in rituals of deference, waiting for the king's attention, trying to gain favor. But this was not just about luxury, it was about power and control. Louis XIV's reign is often called the epitome of absolutism, and yet, he was not the only one. In Russia, Peter the Great was shaping his empire. Peter ruled with the same belief that his power came from God, but his approach was different. He sought to westernize Russia, to make it like the nations of Europe, where kings were strong, where armies were modern, where governments were organized. Peter built a new capital city at St. Petersburg, a city carved from the swamps of the Neva River. It was to be Russia's window to the west. But Peter's absolutism was harsh. He reformed society, forcing nobles to dress in European styles, forcing them to shave their beards. He built an army and a navy, but he also took the lives of many. In England, the idea of absolute monarchy faced resistance. Here, the monarchy was supposed to rule with the consent of the people, but the struggle for power between the king and parliament was growing. In 1625, Charles I took the throne, and he believed in divine right. He ruled without parliament. For years, he taxed his people, he fought wars, he used royal power to control everything, but his authority was challenged. In 1642, the English Civil War began. Royalists fought parliamentarians. The war ended in 1649. Charles I was executed. In the aftermath, Oliver Cromwell took control. For a time, England became a commonwealth, a republic, without a king, but Cromwell ruled, with near absolute power, and when he died, the monarchy was restored. Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, but the struggle for power was not over. While absolute monarchy was thriving, it was also being challenged. In Holland, the Dutch Republic grew in power. The Dutch had no king, instead, they had a system of republican government, and their wealth came from trade. They ruled the seas, they built an empire of merchants, not kings. But in France, the nobility had little power. Louis XIV had crushed their resistance. His palace at Versailles had reduced them to courtiers, and his laws, his will, became law. His son King Reign was an embodiment of this ideal: one king, one power, no checks, no balance. Absolutism spread across Europe, from Prussia to Spain, from Austria to Sweden. It was the age of kings, and each king, in his own way, built his own empire. But it was also an age of paradox. Absolutism gave the monarchs power, but it also created instability. The nobility were kept in check, but they would not remain so forever. The people had little voice, but that would change too. The 18th century, a time of change, a time of reason, a time of ideas, a time when the old order began to fray at the edges, a time when kings and queens began to feel the pressure of thought, of philosophy, of the Enlightenment. This is the age where the absolute power of monarchs met its match, not through swords, not through armies, but through the power of the mind, of reason. It began slowly, but it grew. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement, focused on reason, progress, and individual rights. Thinkers, philosophers, writers, they challenged the old ways, they questioned everything, they questioned God, they questioned kings, they questioned the very nature of society. They said, reason is the light, not blind faith, and this was the beginning of a revolution, but not a revolution of violence. Yet, in France, the most famous of these thinkers was Voltaire. He wrote with wit, with sarcasm. He challenged the church, he challenged the monarchy. His work spread across Europe, and they did more than entertain. They made people think. Another key figure was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote about the social contract, the idea that power comes from the people, not from divine right. Rousseau argued that a government should only exist if it had the consent of the governed. His ideas shook the foundations of monarchy. Montesquieu, another philosopher, wrote about the separation of powers. He argued that government should not be controlled by one man, but should have different branches: legislative, executive, judicial. This, too, would inspire revolutions later. The Enlightenment spread from France to England, from Germany to Italy. In England, John Locke developed the idea that all people had natural rights, rights to life, liberty, and property. His philosophy influenced the American Revolution, and the ideas of democracy that would spread across the globe. As these ideas spread, the age of absolutism began to lose its grip. Kings and queens could no longer claim that they ruled by divine right. The ideas of the Enlightenment had taken hold. People were thinking, and thinking led to questioning. In France, the bourgeoisie, the rising middle class, began to demand more. They wanted a say in how the country was run. They saw the nobility, with its privileges, and they resented it. The French Revolution would not be far behind. The American Revolution was also inspired by these ideas. In 1776, the American colonies broke away from Britain. They did not want a king, they wanted to govern themselves, with a constitution, with a Bill of Rights. This, too, was a challenge to the old system. Kings began to worry, monarchs saw their power threatened, and they began to crack down. But the ideas of the Enlightenment had already taken root. The world was changing. Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia both considered themselves enlightened rulers. They did not want to give up their power, but they also wanted to appear as if they understood the ideas of the Enlightenment. They reformed their countries, but only in ways that still maintained their Control. They allowed more freedom in some areas, but kept their power tight. By the end of the 18th century, the ideas of the Enlightenment had already begun to change the world. Kings and queens could no longer rule as they once had. The power of reason was beginning to reshape the world, but there was still much to be done. The French Revolution would follow in 1789. The American Revolution had already shown that monarchies could be toppled, and now, the Reign of Terror in France would show that the power of reason could come at a great cost. The Enlightenment had begun as a movement of ideas, but it would soon become a movement of change. A revolution, but not yet. In the meantime, the monarchs held on to their power, increasingly uncertain. The challenge had begun, the challenge of thought, the challenge of reason. It was a slow burn, but it would grow. As the centuries passed, the power of monarchs would dwindle. But for now, the age of reason had begun, and the world would never be the same. This is the story of a storm, but not a storm of wind or rain, a storm of ideas, of fear, of change. The year is 1789. France is tired of kings, tired of taxes, tired of hunger, and so, it begins, the French Revolution, a revolution that changed everything. But first, it was slow, like most revolutions are. It began with a crisis, not just one crisis, but many. The king, Louis XVI, was deeply in debt. The wars, the palace, the spending, the country was poor, the people were poorer, and so, they called the Estates General. This hadn't happened in 175 years. 3 groups, 3 estates, the first estate, the clergy, the second estate, the nobility. The third estate, everyone else, and it was the third estate that held the most people, but the least power. They wanted change, they wanted representation, and when they did not get it, they walked out. They formed the National Assembly, and then came the tennis court oath. They would not disband until a new constitution was created. Outside, the people were restless, bread was scarce, prices were high, rumors spread. On July 14, 1789, they stormed the Bastille, a prison, a symbol of royal power. It fell, brick by brick. The revolution had begun. Then came the great fear. In the countryside, peasants rose up, burned manors, destroyed records, attacked landlords. Chaos spread. The National Assembly moved quickly. They abolished feudal privileges, ended noble rights. It was the night of August 4th, and it changed everything. Then, they wrote, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. All men, born free, equal in rights, liberty, property, security. A new age had come, or so it seemed, but the king was not ready to give up power. In October, the women of Paris marched. They walked to Versailles, demanded bread, and brought the king back to Paris, a king no longer in control. The revolution continued, new laws, new reforms, but also new enemies. Other kings, in other lands, saw danger. They feared revolution might spread. In 1792, France declared war on Austria, then Prussia, then others, a war of survival and ideology. At home, radicals gained control. The Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, they abolished the monarchy and created a republic. Then, they tried the king, and on January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, followed. Then came the Reign of Terror, a time of suspicion, of fear, of executions. Robespierre ruled the Committee of Public Safety. He said it was necessary to protect the revolution, but thousands were executed, enemies, friends, strangers. The guillotine worked endlessly, until finally, Robespierre himself was executed. The revolution began to slow. A new government took over. the Directory, 5 men, trying to govern, but they were weak, corrupt, and unpopular. Then came a man, a general, a name, Napoleon Bonaparte. He promised order, stability, victory. In 1799, he seized power, a coup d'état. He became first consul, then emperor. In 1804, he crowned himself a new monarch, but one born from revolution. Napoleon brought change. He reformed laws, created the Napoleonic Code, merit over birth, equality before law, religious tolerance. He spread these ideas across Europe, but he also waged war, many wars. He conquered lands, redrew borders, but with every victory came resistance. In 1812, he invaded Russia and failed. The winter, the cold, the long retreat, then came defeat. In 1814, he was exiled to Elba. He escaped, returned, ruled for 100 days, then Waterloo. Final defeat and exile again to St. Helena, where he would die, and so the revolution ended, but the ideas remained: liberty, equality, fraternity. The monarchy was gone, then returned, but the world had changed. The French Revolution introduced new concepts, modern ideology, ideas of democracy, republicanism, nationalism, secularism. It showed that people could challenge kings, that ideas could become power, that revolutions could reshape the world, but it also showed that freedom can be dangerous, that mobs can kill, that ideals can be twisted. The revolution was not simple, it was not clean, but it was powerful, and its echo would shape the 19th century, from the fields to the factories, from hands to machines, from muscle to steam. This is the story of the Industrial Revolution, a transformation, gradual, relentless, loud, and yet monotonous. It begins in Britain. In the late 18th century, the world was changing, but not with wars, not with revolutions, but with wheels, with gears, with belts, and coal. So much coal, dug from the earth, burned in furnaces, fueling machines, fueling change. It began with textiles, cloth, fabric, thread. Before, all weaving was done by hand, slow, laborious, painful, but then, the machines arrived, the spinning jenny. Invented by James Hargreaves, one worker, many threads. The water frame, Richard Arkwright, larger, faster, powered by water. Then the power loom, machines replaced spinners, replaced weavers, replaced people, production soared. And so, came the factories, large, loud, filled with workers, working long hours, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, in heat, in dust, in danger. Children worked, women worked, men worked, for wages, barely enough to live, but still, they worked, because the countryside was changing too. The agricultural revolution had come earlier. Enclosure laws fenced off common lands, small farmers lost their plots. Forced to move, to cities, to factory towns. Places like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, once villages, now, industrial giants. Smoke filled the air, soot covered the buildings, rivers turned dark with waste. This was progress. At the heart was steam, the steam engine, perfected by James Watt. It powered machines, trains, ships. Steam changed everything. Now factories could be anywhere, not just by rivers. Now movement was fast. The railways came, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, iron rails, iron wheels, coal moved, goods moved, people moved, the world sped up, but life, for many, slowed down. In the mines, men dug coal, with picks, with sweat, with lungs filled with dust. In the mills, women tended machines, endless clatter, endless shifts. Children, as young as 5, crawled under machines, fixing belts. Dodging wheels, accidents, were frequent. Life expectancy was low, but the owners prospered. These were the capitalists, factory owners, entrepreneurs, investors. They built fortunes, mansions, empires. This was capitalism, a new economy, based on profit, on markets, on supply and demand. But not everyone agreed. Some saw the suffering, the poverty, the inequality. Voices emerged: Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. They wrote about class struggle, about the proletariat. And bourgeoisie. They said revolution would come again, not from ideas, but from industry. In the Communist Manifesto, they warned, workers of the world, unite, but the world kept spinning. Governments slowly responded. Factory acts were passed, limiting hours, banning child labor, requiring safety. But change came slowly, as it always does. Unions formed, strikes occurred, wages rose, slightly. Meanwhile, the world watched. France, Germany, the United States. They copied, adapted, industrialized. The revolution spread. It wasn't one event, it was a process, and once it began, it didn't stop. By 1850, the world looked different. Populations grew. Cities expanded, nature retreated, the rural past became memory, the mechanical future was now present. We begin in 1815, the Congress of Vienna. After Napoleon, Europe was tired of war, of revolution. The leaders gathered, kings, princes, diplomats. Their goal: restore the old order, balance power, prevent another Napoleon. So they redrew maps, re-established monarchies, created alliances. It worked, for a while, but beneath the surface, something stirred, a longing to belong, to a people, a culture, a language. This was nationalism. What is a nation? Is it land, a government, a flag, or is it a shared identity, a common tongue, a myth of origin? People began asking, who are we? Are we German, Italian, Polish, or something else? These questions grew louder, in schools, in newspapers, in music, in war. Let us go to Germany. In 1815, there was no Germany. There were 39 German states: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and many others. They formed the German Confederation, loose, unstable, divided, but shared language, and history, and frustration brought them closer. In 1848, revolutions erupted. Liberals demanded unity, constitutions, rights, but the revolutions failed. Kings stayed, borders remained. Then came a man, a statesman, Otto von Bismarck. He believed not in speeches, but in blood and iron. As Prime Minister of Prussia, he had a goal: unite Germany, but on his terms, not with democracy, not with parliaments, but with war. In 1864, he fought Denmark to gain Schleswig and Holstein. In 1866, he fought Austria, a quick war, a victory. Austria was out, Prussia was in charge. Then, in 1870, he provoked France, the Franco-Prussian War. France declared war. Prussia responded, swiftly. France lost. Napoleon III was captured. And in 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Germany was born, the German Empire, united, powerful, new, led not by a parliament, but by a Kaiser. Now we turn to Italy, also divided, kingdoms, duchies, papal lands, different rulers, same language, same dream. One man, Giuseppe Mazzini, spoke of unity, young Italy, republic, but he failed. Then came Count Cavour, Prime Minister of Piedmont Sardinia. He made alliances with France. He fought Austria. Lombardy was gained. In the south, another man, Giuseppe Garibaldi, with his red shirts. He conquered Sicily and Naples, he met Cavour, and gave up power. In 1861, Italy was declared a kingdom, but Rome and Venice were still missing. They came later, Venice in 1866, Rome in 1870, and so, Italy was whole. Mostly, elsewhere, nationalism stirred too. In the Austrian Empire, many peoples lived: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Romanians. They wanted recognition, autonomy. Austria struggled. In 1867, they made a deal: Austria-Hungary, 2 crowns, 1 emperor, a compromise. But tensions remained. In Poland, nationalism had no state. Partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, Poland vanished from the map. But not from hearts, poetry, resistance, hope. The dream of Poland endured, even in places like Ireland. Nationalism grew against British rule, for self-determination. It was not yet revolution, but it was rising. Nationalism also took cultural forms. Languages were standardized, histories rewritten, folktales collected, flags designed, anthems composed. People learned to feel like a nation. It was not natural, it was taught, encouraged, imagined. As the historian said, nations are imagined communities. But those imaginations were powerful. Nationalism could unite, but also divide. It created solidarity, but also exclusion, us and them. It led to pride, but also to conquest. Empires began to use nationalism to justify expansion, to glorify identity. This would have consequences, but not yet. By 1871, Europe was transformed. 2 new nation-states, Germany, Italy, old empires shaken, old orders questioned. A new age had begun, the age of the nation. We now drift into the age of imperialism, a time when empires expanded, and the world was carved up with rulers and pencils and ink. Today, we examine the scramble for Africa. But first, we must understand what made the scramble begin. It begins with Europe. By the 1870s, Europe had changed. Nations were unified, industries were strong, and people were restless. Factories needed resources, markets needed buyers, nations needed prestige, so they looked outward, to lands not yet controlled, to continents not yet civilized, by their measure, to Africa. But before the scramble, Africa was not a blank map. It was full of peoples, of kingdoms, of empires, of trade routes, of histories. There were the Ashanti in the west, the Zulu in the south, the Ethiopian Empire in the east, the Omani Sultanate along the coast. Africa was alive, connected, complex. Europe simply didn't understand it, or chose not to. The scramble for Africa was not sudden, it was slow, then fast. It began with exploration. Men with hats and notebooks wandered inland. David Livingstone, a missionary, a doctor, he disappeared. Then came Henry Morton Stanley. To find him, he found him, and said the famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Then Stanley kept going. He mapped rivers and claimed lands for Belgium. Yes, Belgium, its king, Leopold II, wanted an empire, but Belgium was small, so Leopold made a plan. He created the Congo Free State, a personal colony, not for Belgium, for himself. He promised to bring civilization, but instead, he brought horror, rubber, ivory, violence. Hands were cut off, villages burned. Millions died, all in the name of progress. Soon, the others joined: Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain. They all wanted a peace, so they met. In 1884, they gathered in Berlin, the Berlin Conference. no Africans invited. There, they drew lines, agreed on rules, to avoid fighting each other. While dividing Africa, the conference did not divide Africa directly, but it set the rules for how it would happen. Occupation had to be real. Claims had to be enforced. The race was on. Let us examine who took what. Britain took the East and the South, Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Rhodesia. They dreamed of a line from Cairo to Cape Town. France took the West and the North. Algeria, Senegal, Mali, Madagascar, a wide belt across the Sahara. Germany, new to empire, took scattered parts. Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo. Portugal held on to Angola and Mozambique. Belgium had the Congo. Italy tried for Ethiopia, but failed, then took Libya. Spain took small parts, Saharan coast, Equatorial Guinea. But imperialism was not just maps, it was missions and markets and militaries. Europeans spoke of the civilizing mission. They believed they were helping by building schools and roads and churches, but they destroyed cultures, imposed languages, dismantled traditions. They brought railways and also rifles, hospitals, and handcuffs. In South Africa, the British clashed with the Boers, Dutch settlers. The Boer Wars followed. Long, brutal camps were made. Civilians suffered. In German Southwest Africa, the Herero and Nama rebelled. Germany crushed them. Tens of thousands died. In what many call genocide, Africa was not passive. There was resistance. Samori Touré fought the French. The Zulu, under Shaka and later Cetshwayo, fought the British. Menelik II of Ethiopia defeated Italy. At the Battle of Adwa, in 1896, it was rare, but it happened. Still, the tide was strong. By 1914, almost all of Africa was colonized. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. Imperialism brought change, new borders, new economies. Cash crops replaced food, mines dug deep, forests cleared, traditional rulers were removed, or made puppets. Education changed, but only for a few. A new elite emerged, Western educated, but alienated. Seeds of nationalism were planted. Back in Europe, empires grew proud. They displayed Africa in museums, in books, in world fairs. It was proof of power, of greatness, but they ignored the cost. The scramble for Africa was not about Africa, it was about Europe, their rivalries, their ambitions, their illusions. Africa was the stage, not the author. We begin the march toward the Great War, World War I, but not yet the war itself, only the road that led to it. It is a long road, winding, uneventful, but full of paperwork, of treaties, of rivalries, of names long forgotten, and dates rarely remembered. We begin in the year 1871. In 1871, Europe changed. The Franco-Prussian War had ended. Prussia was victorious, France was humiliated, and on that day, in the Hall of Mirrors, at Versailles, a new empire was born. The German Empire, united, industrialized, militarized, led by Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. He had forged Germany through blood and iron, but now he wanted peace, not because he was kind, but because war was bad for business. So Bismarck began to build a web of alliances to protect Germany, to isolate France. It was called Realpolitik, cold, calculating, effective. He created the Three Emperors League, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, an unstable triangle. He added the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. Then the Triple Alliance with Italy. France was alone. That was the goal. Meanwhile, Britain stood aside, splendid isolation, The empire was vast, its navy ruled the waves, it needed no one, or so it thought. Then, Bismarck fell, in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed him. The young Kaiser was energetic, impulsive, insecure. He wanted a navy, he wanted colonies, he wanted respect. He also let the treaty with Russia expire. A mistake. Russia turned to France. An alliance formed in 1894. Now Germany was no longer surrounded by friends, but by enemies. Let us pause here and examine. The major powers, Germany, a rising industrial giant, with a strong army, and an insecure emperor, Austria-Hungary, a decaying empire, holding together many peoples, Slavs, Magyars, Germans, barely united, Russia, vast, poor, autocratic, eager to protect fellow Slavs, especially in the Balkans. France, still angry over losing Alsace and Lorraine, preparing, waiting, Britain, a sea power, with global interests, watching Germany, with growing suspicion, Italy, an opportunist, nominally allied to Germany, but uncertain. These were the players. The stage was set. Now, the tension builds. Germany began building a navy. Britain noticed. An arms race began. Dreadnoughts were launched. Massive battleships. Steel leviathans. The more Germany built, the more Britain built. Each year, the numbers grew. So too did the fear. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, trouble brewed. The Ottoman Empire was weakening, its territories slipping away. New states emerged. Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and they had ambitions, especially Serbia. It dreamed of uniting the Slavs, creating a greater Serbia. Russia supported them. Austria-Hungary feared them. A fault line appeared. It would widen. In 1905, crisis came. The first Moroccan crisis. Germany challenged French influence. In Morocco, they wanted to test the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain. It failed. Britain supported France. Germany backed down. The alliance strengthened. Then came 1908. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia, a slap to Serbia, an insult to Russia, but war was avoided, just barely. Then, the second Moroccan crisis in 1911, again, Germany tried to flex. They sent a gunboat, the Panther, to Agadir. But again, Britain and France stood firm. Germany blinked, tensions rose. In 1912 and 1913, two Balkan wars erupted. The small states fought each other, old rivals, new borders. Serbia grew stronger, Austria-Hungary grew worried. The powder keg was filling, now. By 1914, two camps had emerged, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, Russia, Britain, two great blocs, facing one another, tightly wound, deeply suspicious. Any spark could ignite war. They did not know how close they were. And beneath it all, new ideas stirred. Nationalism made people proud and reckless. Militarism made war seem glorious. Imperialism spread competition overseas. And alliances made local crises global. Each nation thought it was ready. Each nation thought it would win. Quickly, easily. They were wrong. Today, we enter the year 1914, a year that began with tension and ended with war. But it did not begin with armies. It began with an archduke, a car, and a bullet. Let us begin with a man named Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, tall, mustached, often irritable, but reform-minded. On June 28, 1914, he visited Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary, but many of its people were Slavs, like the Serbians, and many wanted independence. That day, Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, drove in an open car. It was a Sunday. The streets were warm, the crowds. Mixed, some cheering, some glaring. Among them were assassins, members of a group called the Black Hand. They were young, nationalist, radical. One of them was Gavrilo Princip. The first attempt failed, a bomb missed, it exploded behind the car, several officers were injured, but Franz Ferdinand kept going. Later that morning, his driver took a wrong turn, right in front of a cafe, where Princip just happened to be standing, a chance that changed history. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. Sophie died first, then Franz Ferdinand. It was 11 a.m. And in that moment, peace unraveled. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. They wanted revenge, but they hesitated, so they turned to Germany. Germany gave them a blank check, full support, no matter what. On July 23, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Demands were harsh, almost impossible to accept. Serbia accepted most, but not all. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. July 28, 1914, Russia mobilized to defend Serbia and to show strength. Germany warned Russia. Russia did not stop, so Germany declared war on Russia, August 1st. Then, Germany declared war on France, August 3rd. Then, Germany invaded Belgium. Belgium was neutral. Britain had pledged to protect it, so Britain declared war on Germany, August 4th. In less than 2 weeks, Europe was ablaze. The alliance system had done its work. What began as one assassination had become a world war. Let us pause and breathe and examine why. Some say the assassination caused the war, but others see it differently. They say the war was already coming. The assassination was only the spark. The powder had been stored for years. Let us list the reasons. 1. Militarism. Nations had built armies, and they wanted to use them. 2. Alliances. Pacts meant local wars became global. 3. Imperialism. Empires competed for land, for pride. 4. Nationalism. Peoples believed they were superior, or oppressed, or both. These forces swirled together. For years, the assassination simply broke the dam. And now, let us examine the war plans. Germany had one. It was called the Schlieffen Plan. It assumed a two-front war, France in the west, Russia in the east. But Germany believed Russia would be slow, so they planned to knock out France quickly by invading through Belgium, then turning to face Russia. It was ambitious, but flawed. France had a plan too, Plan 17. It focused on offense toward Alsace and Lorraine. But it underestimated Germany and the terrain. Russia mobilized faster than expected, and Austria-Hungary was slower than anyone imagined. Italy stayed neutral for now, and Britain sent the British Expeditionary Force, small but professional. By August, millions marched to the front, and yet they believed the war would be short, over by Christmas, a quick campaign. They were wrong. Now let us revisit the early battles. Germany invaded Belgium, met resistance, destroyed towns, civilians were shot, the world was horrified. Propaganda called it the rape of Belgium. But the German army advanced fast. They reached the Marne River, near Paris. Then, France counterattacked. The first battle of the Marne, early September. The Germans were pushed back, slightly, but enough. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Both sides dug in, trenches formed, and the war became static. In the east, Russia invaded East Prussia. Two armies, but poorly coordinated. Germany responded. Battle of Tannenberg, late August, a crushing German victory. Entire Russian army destroyed. Commander suicided. Morale fell in Russia, but the front remained open. by the end of 1914, the war had settled into trenches, mud, barbed wire, the Western Front, from the North Sea to Switzerland, the Eastern Front, more fluid. And in the south, Serbia still held, Austria-Hungary was struggling. And then came Christmas, 1914, something strange happened. Soldiers stopped fighting, they sang, exchanged gifts, played football, the Christmas truce, unofficial, temporary, and soon, the shells resumed, but for a moment, humanity returned, and so, 1914 ended, the world was at war, but no one knew how long it would last, how deep the trenches would go, how high the cost would rise. They thought it would be quick. They were wrong. Now, we step into 1915, the year of stalemate, the year of trenches, the year of attrition. The war had begun with hope for a short, decisive conflict, but by 1915, the reality was clear, the war would not be over soon. It would not be quick, instead, it would become a war of attrition, a battle of wills, a battle of resources, a battle of survival. The trenches had taken shape, lines drawn across Europe, from the North Sea, down to Switzerland, and in between, the mud, the barbed wire, the soldiers, the artillery, the endless, repetitive conflict. In the West, the Western Front, the trench warfare, on the one side, Germany. On the other, Britain and France, and in the middle, a hell of mud and death. The year began with the Second Battle of Ypres, in April 1915. Here, the Germans used a new weapon, poison gas, the first large-scale use of gas in warfare. It was devastating. It caused choking, burns, blindness, a slow death, but it did not break the stalemate. Meanwhile, in the East, the Eastern Front continued. Germany and Austria-Hungary were fighting against Russia. Russia was large, poor, slow, but it had numbers. But the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, were better prepared, and they began to push Russia back, slowly. In the south, the Balkan Front was active, Austria-Hungary, fighting Serbia, Germans helping out, but Serbia held strong. Then, in May 1915, Italy joined the war, on the side of the Allies, hoping to expand its territories. It attacked Austria-Hungary, in the Alps, on the Isonzo River, but the Italians found themselves in difficulty. The Austro-Hungarians held their ground. By the summer of 1915, the war had turned into something deeper, more exhausting. The fronts had stabilized, and now, the fighting was about wearing down the other side, little by little, but the Western Front remained the main focus. Verdun would be its epitome. Verdun, the battle that would come to symbolize the entire war. It began in February 1916, but the planning and preparation began in 1915. The Germans wanted to bleed France dry, to force them to defend Verdun, to the last man. They thought they could break France's spirit. France, for its part, had no choice but to defend Verdun. It was sacred ground, a symbol of French pride. The battle would be long, it would be costly, it would be brutal. It would become a battle of attrition, but in 1915, before Verdun, it was clear that each side was building up for something more, a battle of exhaustion. The build-up was already taking its toll. Meanwhile, on the sea, the Navy continued its role. Germany attempted to break the British blockade. But Britain's Royal Navy held firm. The seas were theirs. For now, back on land, the war of attrition dragged on. Every soldier knew the cycle, the endless waiting, the assaults, the counterattacks, the bombardments, the trench foot, the lice, the rats. The living conditions were atrocious. Men in the trenches, living in mud and water, fighting for inches, not miles. The soldiers felt the weight of time, the endless nature of it all. But the weapons too evolved, machine guns that could mow down waves of men, artillery, that could flatten entire forests, tanks, still in the experimental phase, but on the horizon, the Allied powers sought to break through, but the Germans, too, were ready. In the air, planes began to be used for reconnaissance, bombing, dogfights, a new frontier, but still primitive. Let us now turn our attention to the trenches. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Men stand on the front line. At dawn, the silence, then, at times, the distant rumble of artillery, the scream of shells, then the whistle, the order, the charge, and the endless confusion, the chaos, behind the lines. The supply trains move, bringing ammunition, food, clothing, but never enough. The soldiers sleep, or try to. The mud is everywhere, the cold, too, but they endure, they hold. Through the year, the lines hardly moved, the battlefront remained almost the same. The Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, another front, failed for the Allies, a large effort to capture the Dardanelles, to knock out the Ottoman Empire. It ended in failure. Another attrition, another stalemate. By the end of 1915, the war was deeper, longer, more exhausting. It had become the war of the trenches, the war of attrition. The goal was simple: wear down the other side, until they could no longer fight. But the cost was immense. 1916, the year when the war of attrition truly took hold, a year of blood, a year of sacrifice, but most importantly, a year of two battles, two monumental clashes that would define the war: Verdun and the Somme. Let us begin with Verdun, the battle that came to symbolize the soul-crushing nature of the war. The Germans had a plan, a simple plan: to bleed France dry. To force them to defend the city of Verdun, no matter the cost, to make it so costly that the French would have no choice but to surrender. The French were determined. Verdun was sacred ground, a symbol of national pride, and so they stood their ground. The battle began on February 21, 1916, and it would last for 10 months. The Germans launched a massive attack, huge artillery bombardments, tens of thousands of shells, every day, day after day. The French held on, the French dug in, they built forts, they created supply lines. But the Germans pushed forward, and the French were forced to retreat, little by little, through the mud, through the endless barrage. The casualties mounted, on both sides. The Germans' goal was clear: to take Verdun, to break the French spirit, but the French fought back. And the battle turned into a test of endurance. The Germans kept pushing, the French kept holding, and all the while, the artillery rained down. For 10 months, the French fought, the Germans fought, but neither side could break. The casualties were horrendous. Over 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. But the battle ended in a stalemate. Now let us turn to the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. A battle that has come to symbolize the futility of trench warfare, a battle where soldiers went over the top, into a wall of machine gun fire. The battle began on July 1, 1916, an offensive led by the British and the French, against the Germans, on the Western Front. The plan was to break the stalemate, to push through the German lines, to make progress, to end the war, but it did not go as planned. The British began the assault with a huge bombardment, days of artillery. The ground shook, the earth was torn apart. For days, the Germans were hammered by shellfire, and then, on July 1, the infantry went over the top. The British soldiers had been told that the bombardment would have destroyed the German defenses, but it had not. The Germans had dug deep, they had prepared. When the British came over the top, the machine guns opened fire. It was a slaughter. The British lost over 19,000 men on that first day, the bloodiest day in British military history. The battle raged on for months, through July, August, September. Each day, more lives were lost. The goal was the same: break through. Push forward, take the ground. but the ground was held. By November 18th, the battle finally ended. Over 1 million men were casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The gains were small. The losses were enormous, and the war went on. But what of the men, the soldiers, the ones who fought and died in these battles? They were the ones who endured, the ones who spent months in the trenches, the ones who lived in constant fear. They faced the constant shellfire, the rats, the lice, the mud, the disease. And yet, they pressed on, they fought, they sacrificed. For what? For a few yards of land, for a victory that never came. The soldiers of Verdun and the Somme became symbols of endurance, of the horrors of war, of the costs of battle. As we look back on 1916, we see two battles that define the war, two battles that show the horror and the futility. Two battles that showed the terrible cost of attrition. The battlefields of Verdun and the Somme are etched in history, but there was more to come. There were more battles, more blood, more sacrifice. The war was not over, not by a long shot, but these battles remain as markers in the long, slow march of World War I. It is now 1917, the year when the war began to expand into new territories, new fronts, a year when nations and their soldiers would be called upon in ways they had never imagined. Let us take a step back, a step into the year 1917. As we left off in 1916, the world was entrenched in a brutal stalemate. The battles of Verdun and the Somme had ravaged the soldiers and the landscape. But now, the year had turned. It was time for new developments, new strategies, new horrors. In 1917, the war would continue on the Western Front, but new players would enter the fray, new fronts would emerge, and the tide of the war would begin to shift, slowly. But let us first take a moment to examine the situation. In the East, the Eastern Front had been relatively quiet in 1916, but by 1917, things were changing. Russia, tired and suffering, was beginning to crumble. The country was torn by internal strife. Revolution was in the air. The Russian Revolution had begun, and the Russian Empire was on the brink of collapse. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, were gaining momentum. They promised to end the war, to bring peace to Russia. By March 1917, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was overthrown. He abdicated the throne. The Russian provisional government took power, but this new government was weak, and it could not keep up the fight on the Eastern Front. The Russian soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized, began to mutiny. The front lines began to disintegrate. In the West, the situation was still dire. The trench warfare continued. The Allied powers were locked in a brutal struggle with Germany. The lines hardly moved. But by 1917, the Allies began to push back. In April, the United States entered the war. The entry of the United States was a turning point. The war had been raging for 3 years, and the Allies, particularly the French and the British, were in desperate need of fresh troops. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, declared war on Germany. The addition of the United States brought new strength to the Allies, new resources, new soldiers, but the United States was not yet fully prepared for war. It would take time for their military to be mobilized, and so, the war on the Western Front continued. The year 1917 also brought new tactics, new strategies. The British launched several offensives, including the Third Battle of Ypres, which began in July 1917. It was another attempt to break through the German lines, but like the battles before it, it ended in little more than more casualties and more stalemate. The Battle of Cambrai also took place in November 1917. Here, the British used a new weapon, tanks. The tanks were still in their infancy, but they showed promise. They could cross the battlefield, destroying barbed wire, crushing enemy positions, and providing support to infantry. But despite the technological advancements, the war remained largely unchanged. The trench warfare continued. the soldiers continued to endure, and in the east, the Russian Revolution was taking its toll. The Bolsheviks seized power, and the Russian Empire collapsed. In December 1917, Russia signed an armistice with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended the fighting on the Eastern Front. Now, Germany could focus more of its efforts on the Western Front. But the war was far from over. In the midst of all this, the Ottoman Empire was still in the fight. It had joined the Central Powers in 1914, and it had been engaged in a series of battles against the British, the French, and the Russians. In 1917, the Ottomans continued to hold their ground, but they were beginning to lose territory. The war in the Middle East saw the British launch campaigns against the Ottomans. One of the most famous campaigns was the Arab Revolt, which began in 1916 and lasted into 1917. Led by Lawrence of Arabia, the revolt sought to drive the Ottomans out of the region. The war was expanding. The Allies were making gains, but the Central Powers were far from defeated, and in 1917, the world continued to bleed. Back on the Western Front, the war dragged on. The French launched several offensives, but each one ended in more carnage. The Battle of Aisne in May 1917, for example, was another attempt to break through, but it led to little more than more bloodshed, and the Germans, they were still holding firm. The war of attrition continued, but there were signs of change, small shifts, new developments, the entry of the United States, the collapse of Russia, the use of tanks. All of these would play a role in the coming years, but for now, the war continued, and it continued to expand. It is now, the year 1918, a year of great uncertainty, a year of desperation, a year of final attempts. The war has stretched on for nearly 4 years. Millions have died, millions more have suffered, entire nations have been transformed, by exhaustion, by hunger, by loss. But for Germany, there is still one last chance. Let us begin with the Spring Offensive, also known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Kaiser's Battle. It was the final gamble by the German Empire to end the war before the full might of the United States could arrive on the Western Front. Germany knew that time was running out. Russia had exited the war. Germany now had divisions. Freed up from the Eastern Front, they transferred more than 50 divisions to the west. With these reinforcements, Germany hoped to deliver a decisive blow against the Allies. Before American troops arrived in large numbers, the offensive began. On March 21, 1918, it was the largest German attack on the Western Front since 1914. It was codenamed Operation Michael. The objective was simple: break through the Allied lines before reinforcements could arrive, split the British and French forces, drive a wedge between them, force the British to retreat to the Channel, force the French to fall back, end the war. The German attack was swift, violent, and well coordinated. It began with an enormous artillery bombardment. Over 6,000 German guns, fired for 5 hours, on a narrow front. They targeted not only trenches, but also supply lines, communications, and rear areas. This was followed by waves of elite stormtroopers. These were specially trained German troops, who bypassed strongpoints, moved quickly, and targeted weak areas. At first, the offensive worked. It shocked the Allies. The front began to buckle. The British were pushed back nearly 40 miles, in some areas, but Germany's early success was also its greatest weakness. The more the Germans advanced, the more they stretched their supply lines. The troops became tired, hungry, disorganized. There was no clear objective. Beyond the initial breakthrough, there was no strategic goal, no reserve plan, just movement forward. The Allies regrouped. They held key positions. The French and British began to counterattack. The Germans had gained ground, but not victory. By April, Germany launched a second phase, Operation Georgette. it targeted the Lys River area, hoping to capture the city of Ypres. Again, there were gains, but again, the Germans could not capitalize. In May, another attack, Operation Blucher, York, this time. They reached within 60 miles of Paris. French civilians fled, the city braced for shelling, but once more, Germany lacked the strength to finish the job. By June, the German army was exhausted, casualties were immense, supplies were dwindling, and the Americans were arriving. In May 1918, the American Expeditionary Force, under General John J. Pershing, began participating in combat operations. At the Battle of Cantigny, American troops performed well, their numbers continued to grow, day by day. By the summer of 1918, over 1 million American soldiers were in France. In July, Germany launched its final offensive, the Second Battle of the Marne. It was meant to be the final push. But this time, the Allies were ready. The French, British, American, and Italian forces met the Germans head-on. They launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back. The tide had turned, the spring offensive had failed, Germany had used up its last reserves, its best troops, its final hopes. Now, the Allies were ready to push back. The war was entering its final phase. But the human cost was unimaginable. The spring offensive had claimed nearly 700,000 German casualties. The Allies suffered close to 850,000. Cities were destroyed, villages wiped out, landscapes torn apart, and yet, nothing had changed. The war continued. At home, Germany was beginning to fall apart. Food was scarce, inflation was rising, protests were growing. The people were tired of war, of death, of failure. The army was still in the field, but the nation was crumbling. Meanwhile, the Allies were reorganizing. A new supreme commander, Ferdinand Foch, was appointed to coordinate Allied efforts. For the first time, French, British, American, and other Allied forces were unified under one command. They began preparing for a new series of offensives, but that is for the next part. The spring offensive was Germany's last gamble, a desperate strike. In a war that had gone on too long, it showed that the German army could still fight, still win battles, but it could not win the war. We now arrive at the final campaign, the concluding series of battles that would bring the world to the end of a conflict it could barely understand, let alone endure. It is now August 1918, the Central Powers are weakening. Germany has failed to break through, Austria-Hungary is faltering, and the Ottoman Empire is stretched thin. The Allies, for the first time in years, see a path forward, a way out, but the way out requires one last, sustained, and exhausting push. This is the 100 Days Offensive. The term, 100 Days Offensive, refers not to one battle, but to a coordinated sequence of Allied attacks between August 8th and November 11th, 1918. It begins with a whisper, a plan, a decision to act, unified, relentless, purposeful. At the head of it all is General Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander. Under his direction, French, British, American, Canadian, Australian, and other forces will coordinate as one. No longer fighting as separate armies, but as a single, united front. The offensive begins on August 8, 1918, at the Battle of Amiens. It is here that the Allies unleash a new kind of war, a combination of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft. There is no prolonged artillery bombardment, no warning, just sudden, synchronized movement. The German army is caught off guard. Their lines begin to crumble. On the first day alone, they lose over 15,000 prisoners. General Erich Ludendorff, one of Germany's top commanders, will later call August 8th the Black Day of the German army. But this is only the beginning. The Allies press forward, they rotate attacking divisions. They deny the Germans rest, there is no single decisive blow, only a steady, grinding, unrelenting pressure. After Amiens, come more battles, the Second Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Albert, the Battle of Arras, the Hindenburg Line. One by one, Germany's defensive positions begin to collapse, the Germans begin to retreat, but it is not a rout, they fight back, skillfully, delaying wherever they can. But they can no longer win, their army is tired, their supplies are low, their people have lost hope. Back home, Germany is unraveling, strikes, riots, starvation, despair, even the army begins to break down, discipline erodes, desertions increase. Officers report growing refusal to obey orders. As the Allies advance, the pace quickens. On September 26, the Meuse-Argonne offensive begins. It is the largest operation ever launched by the American Expeditionary Forces. Over 1.2 million American soldiers participate. The terrain is difficult, thick forests, hills, fog, barbed wire, machine guns, but the Americans push forward, slowly, deliberately, relentlessly. In the south, French forces break through the Saint-Mihiel salient. In Belgium, the Belgians and British recapture lost ground. In the Balkans, Serbian and French troops push into Macedonia, forcing Bulgaria to sue for peace. On September 29, in the Middle East, British and Arab forces liberate Damascus and drive the Ottomans into retreat. Everywhere, the Central Powers are falling apart. On the Italian front, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto sees Italian forces defeating the Austro-Hungarians. Austria-Hungary, fractured by ethnic divisions, can no longer hold. They surrender. On November 3, 1918, Germany now stands alone. By late October, German naval crews mutiny. They refuse orders to launch a final, suicidal attack. This mutiny spreads to soldiers, to civilians, to cities across Germany. On November 9, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicates the throne. He flees to the Netherlands. Germany is now a republic, but the war is not quite over. At 5 a.m., on the morning of November 11, 1918, German and Allied representatives meet in a railcar in the forest of Compiègne, France. They sign the armistice. It will take effect at 11 a.m. that same day, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The guns fall silent. After more than 4 years, the war is over. The 100 Days Offensive has achieved what years of slaughter could not, but the cost was staggering. Over 1.8 million casualties on both sides. During the last 100 days alone, cities lie in ruin, families broken, empires destroyed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, the Ottoman Empire collapsing, the German Empire abolished, and soon a new map of Europe would be drawn. But for now, in this moment, there is quiet. There is no cheering, no celebrations, only silence, and grief, and relief. The soldiers begin to return home, but home is not what it once was, and neither are they. The war is over, but the consequences have only just begun. The guns have now fallen silent. It is the end of 1918. The world is no longer at war, but peace has not yet arrived. In this episode, we explore the aftermath, the reckoning, the attempts to rebuild, and the treaty that promised peace, but sowed the seeds of another war. This is the story of the Treaty of Versailles. The war is over, but Europe is broken. Towns and cities lie in ruins, fields are cratered and bare, mines flooded, factories shattered, railways torn apart. Millions have died, millions more wounded or lost or never came home, an entire generation, scarred, invisible wounds, and visible graves, the Central Powers, are defeated. Germany is a republic now, the Kaiser has fled, the economy is in collapse, Austria-Hungary has ceased to exist, its empire, splintered into fragments, the Ottoman Empire is gasping in its final days, Bulgaria is defeated and isolated, the world is waiting to find out what peace will look like. In January 1919, delegates from around the world gather in Paris, there. In the grand halls of the French capital, they will attempt to negotiate peace. This becomes known as the Paris Peace Conference. Over 30 nations attend, thousands of diplomats, dozens of committees, millions of words, endless speeches, but the real decisions will be made by just a few. The main powers are France, led by Georges Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger; Britain, represented by David Lloyd George; the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson; and Italy, represented by Vittorio Orlando. But it is the first three who hold true power. They are called the Big Three. Each of them arrives with different goals. Clemenceau wants revenge. France has suffered deeply. He demands reparations. Security, punishment for Germany. Lloyd George is caught in the middle. He seeks a balance, punish Germany, but not so much that it cannot recover. Wilson brings his 14 points, a vision of peace, based on justice, self-determination, and international cooperation. He dreams of a League of Nations, but dreams are fragile things, and what of Germany? They are not invited to the negotiations. They are told to wait, to listen, and, eventually, to sign. In June 1919, German delegates are summoned to the Palace of Versailles. There, in the Hall of Mirrors, they are presented with the terms. The Treaty of Versailles is long, nearly 440 articles, but some terms stand out. Germany must accept full responsibility for starting the war. This is known as the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. It will haunt Germany. For years to come, Germany must pay reparations, an enormous sum, eventually calculated at 132 billion gold marks, a burden that would last generations. Territorial losses follow. Germany must surrender Alsace-Lorraine to France, Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium, Northern Schleswig to Denmark. The Saar Basin is placed under League control. The Rhineland is demilitarized. Germany's overseas colonies are taken and handed to the Allies as mandates. Its military is dismantled. The army is limited to 100,000 men, no tanks, no air force, no submarines, only 6 naval ships. The German General Staff is disbanded. Conscription is abolished. The treaty is signed. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a circle, now complete, but the mood in Germany is not one of peace, it is one of humiliation, outrage, betrayal. Many Germans call it the Diktat, a dictated peace. They see the treaty not as a resolution, but as an injustice. Radical voices rise from the right and from the left. The seeds of instability are sown. And what of Wilson's League of Nations? It is created, a new international body, a dream of cooperation, but the United States Senate refuses to ratify the treaty. America does not join the League. The League begins life, already weakened, its authority questioned, its future uncertain. Other treaties follow. The Treaty of Saint-Germain dismantles Austria-Hungary. The Treaty of Trianon redraws Hungary's borders. The Treaty of Sèvres, and later Lausanne, divide the Ottoman Empire. New nations appear: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Borders are drawn, some with care, others with haste. Many with consequences. The world hopes for lasting peace, but beneath the surface, resentment grows. The 1920s will bring economic hardship, hyperinflation in Germany, political extremism, revolution, authoritarianism. The peace will not hold. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to end all war, but it became a prelude. Its legacy, complex, its intentions, noble, its results, mixed. The war is over, but the peace has only just begun. This is part 26, the beginning of the interwar period. We will now descend into the years between the wars, years marked not by the clash of armies, but by uncertainty, rebuilding, and the quiet spread of something darker. It is now 1919, the guns have fallen silent, the world tries to recover, but the wounds run deep. Europe is tired, exhausted, weary, but not healed. The Treaty of Versailles has been signed, the maps of Europe have changed, new nations emerge, old empires collapse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is no more, the Ottoman Empire is in retreat, the Russian Empire has been replaced by a new and uncertain force. The Bolsheviks, and Germany is wounded, humbled, but not broken. We begin with Germany. The Weimar Republic is now in place. It is a democracy, but a fragile one. It inherits debt, discontent, and humiliation. The Republic's leaders face uprisings from the left and from the right. In 1919, the Spartacist uprising erupts in Berlin, led by communists, suppressed with violence. Later that year, the Kapp Putsch, a right-wing coup attempt, threatens the fragile order. The economy is in crisis. Inflation begins. By 1923, it will become hyperinflation. People carry banknotes in wheelbarrows. Bread costs millions. Savings evaporate. Trust collapses. And in the shadows, extremism begins to grow across the border. France seeks security. It enforces the terms of the Versailles Treaty strictly. In 1923, France and Belgium occupy the Ruhr Valley, a key industrial region of Germany. This is a response to Germany's failure to make reparations payments. The occupation leads to strikes, passive resistance, economic chaos. The German mark plummets in value. Confidence in the Republic continues to erode. Meanwhile, Britain tries to recover. The war has drained its economy. Its global influence remains strong, but cracks begin to show. In 1921, a coal miners' strike shakes the economy. Unemployment grows. Political tension simmers. The empire is intact, but not unchallenged. In Ireland, the struggle for independence has erupted into violence. The Irish War of Independence leads to the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. Ireland becomes the Irish Free State. In 1922, the United Kingdom is forever changed. Italy is restless. It has won the war, but feels cheated at the peace table. It expected more territory, more recognition. Disappointment breeds discontent. In 1919 and 1920, Italy experiences social upheaval, called the Biennio Rosso, or 2 red years, strikes, factory occupations, peasant land seizures. Fear of revolution spreads. Into this chaos steps a new force. A former socialist, a newspaper editor, a charismatic speaker. His name is Benito Mussolini. He forms the Fascist Party in 1919. His followers, the Black Shirts, begin to use violence against leftist groups. In 1922, he marches on Rome. The king does not resist. Mussolini becomes prime minister. Fascism has entered European politics. It will not be the last time. Let us now turn to Russia. In 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power. Now, they face a civil war. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, against the Whites, a mix of monarchists, liberals, and foreign supporters. The war is brutal. millions die, famine spreads, villages are burned, executions are common. By 1922, the Bolsheviks emerge victorious, the Soviet Union is born, led by Vladimir Lenin, but plagued by instability. In 1921, Lenin introduces the new economic policy to stabilize the economy, a mix of socialism and limited capitalism. The experiment is temporary, but it buys time. In the background, a quiet, calculating man rises through the ranks. His name is Joseph Stalin. He will matter later. In the United States, the war has ended, but it chooses isolation. It refuses to join the League of Nations. In 1920, Warren G. Harding wins the presidency, with a promise, a return to normalcy. The U.S. focuses inward, economic growth begins. The roaring 20s take shape, jazz, consumer goods, stock markets. But beneath the surface, all is not well. Prohibition begins in 1920, alcohol is banned, but illegal trade flourishes, crime rises, so does resentment. Elsewhere, in the Middle East, former Ottoman lands are divided. Britain controls Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan. France governs Syria and Lebanon. Borders are drawn, with rulers and pens, with little regard for people. Resentment builds. Seeds of future conflict are quietly planted, and in Asia, Japan emerges stronger. It had sided with the Allies. It gained former German colonies in the Pacific. It begins to look outward. Industrial growth continues. Military influence expands. Tensions rise with China. In 1923, Tokyo is struck by the Great Kanto earthquake. Over 100,000 die. The destruction is vast. The government uses the crisis to consolidate control. Nationalism deepens. Meanwhile, the League of Nations begins its work. It seeks peace, disarmament, cooperation. It handles disputes, mediates conflicts, but it has no army, no true power, and, crucially, no United States. It is an idea ahead of its time, or behind it. History will decide. These early interwar years are not quiet. They are filled with the tremors of change, new ideologies, unstable economies, broken societies. A fragile peace hangs in the balance. The world believes it has avoided another war, but it does not yet know. It is merely intermission. We begin with Europe, still bruised from the Great War, still breathing, but not yet healed. It is now 1924. The wounds of the post-war years are beginning to form scars, but underneath the surface, pressure continues to build. In Germany, the crisis of hyperinflation has reached its terrible peak. By late 1923, a loaf of bread costs billions of marks. Workers are paid twice a day, so they can spend money before its value vanishes. But by late 1924, a plan is introduced, the Dawes Plan, engineered by American banker Charles G. Dawes. It restructures German reparations. Loans flow in from the United States. Industry begins to recover. The new currency, the Rentenmark, stabilizes the economy. For a while, it seems that the worst has passed. Germany enters a brief period of calm. This is known as the Golden Twenties in Germany, but gold is only on the surface. Beneath is borrowed money and political fragility. In France, the occupation of the Ruhr has yielded little. Costs have risen. International pressure mounts. In 1925, leaders meet in Locarno, Switzerland. There, the Locarno treaties are signed. Germany, France, Belgium, Britain, and Italy agree to respect borders and commit to peace. It is hailed as a diplomatic success. Germany is even allowed into the League of Nations. In 1926, the European order seems stable, but only for now. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini is strengthening his grip. Since the March on Rome in 1922, he has slowly dismantled democracy. In 1925, he declares himself Il Duce, the leader. Opposition parties are dissolved, press freedoms are restricted, the fascist state begins to take shape. It promises order, pride, a return to glory, but it rests on fear. Let us now turn to the United Kingdom. The post-war economy is sluggish, unemployment remains high, labor unrest simmers. In 1926, a massive general strike unfolds. Over 1.5 million workers refuse to work. It lasts 9 days. It paralyzes transport, industry, and communication. The government responds firmly. Order is restored, but trust erodes. Class tensions remain unresolved. Across the Atlantic, the United States appears prosperous. The economy is booming. The stock market climbs. New technologies emerge: automobiles, radios, consumer appliances. Advertising grows. Credit is used freely. The 1920s are roaring, but the sound is hollow. In 1924, President Calvin Coolidge wins election. He favors limited government. Business flourishes. He famously says, "The business of America is business," but beneath the optimism are structural weaknesses. Agriculture is struggling. Rural America faces poverty. Income inequality rises. Workers face wage stagnation. Stock speculation grows. Untethered from reality, few notice the signs, even fewer act. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Lenin dies. In January 1924, a power struggle begins. Two men emerge as rivals: Leon Trotsky, an intellectual, an orator, a revolutionary, and Joseph Stalin, quiet, cunning, relentless. By 1927, Stalin outmaneuvers Trotsky. Trotsky is expelled from the Communist Party. Later, from the Soviet Union itself, Stalin now rules alone. He begins consolidating power, laying the groundwork for totalitarian rule. The first 5-year plan is announced in 1928. Rapid industrialization, collectivization of agriculture. The plan promises growth, but brings suffering. Millions will die, but that is for a later chapter. In Eastern Europe, new nations struggle: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia. All formed after the war, face unstable governments. In Poland, Józef Pilsudski leads a coup in 1926. He rules as a semi-authoritarian leader. In Hungary, the regency of Miklos Horthy continues. Democracy is limited, tensions rise, nationalism grows, minority groups face discrimination, ethnic conflict simmers. In the Middle East, British and French mandates continue, resistance grows. In Iraq, in Syria, in Palestine. In 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood is founded in Egypt. A movement begins, slow, ideological, religious, another seed for future struggle. In China, chaos reigns. The country is fragmented. Warlords control regions. The central government is weak. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen dies. He is replaced by Chiang Kai-shek. He launches the Northern Expedition to unify China under the Kuomintang. By 1928, Chiang captures Beijing, but unity is fragile. Conflict with communists and with Japan awaits. In Japan, the military gains influence. In 1927, a financial crisis hits, banks collapse, confidence is shaken, the government turns to conservative leadership, nationalism rises, militarism takes root, tensions with China intensify, a storm brews, and so, by 1929, the world appears stable, but it is not. The peace is thin, the prosperity is uneven, the institutions are weak, and then, in October 1929, the Wall Street crash begins, stocks fall, panic spreads, fortunes vanish, the illusion shatters. It begins, on a Thursday, October 24, 1929, Wall Street, the market wavers, prices fall, selling increases. By Tuesday, October 29th, known forever as Black Tuesday, the collapse is complete, billions vanish, investors are ruined, confidence evaporates, the crash is not the cause, it is the trigger. The seeds had long been sown. In the United States, the boom of the 1920s was built on speculation, stock buying. On margin, borrowed money, few regulations. Between 1925 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had more than doubled. When the crash comes, the system is unprepared, banks fail, businesses close, unemployment rises. In 1930, the Smoot-Hawley tariff is passed. It raises tariffs on imported goods. Other countries retaliate. World trade collapses. By 1931, the Depression is global. Back in America, President Herbert Hoover resists federal intervention. He believes in the market, in self-reliance, in volunteerism. He creates limited relief programs, but they are not enough. By 1932, unemployment reaches over 25%, farmers lose land, cities see mass evictions, Hoovervilles, shantytowns made of scrap, appear on the outskirts of major cities, public confidence crumbles. In Europe, the depression spreads, like a slow-moving fog. Germany, still dependent on American loans, is hit especially hard. The Weimar Republic faces unemployment, inflation, despair. The fragile democracy begins to fracture. Radical parties gain strength. Communists on the left, National Socialists on the right. By 1932, the Nazi Party becomes the largest in the Reichstag. Political paralysis ensues. President Hindenburg reluctantly appoints Adolf Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933. The consequences will be catastrophic. Elsewhere in Europe, Britain leaves the gold standard in 1931. Its empire softens the blow, but unemployment still rises. The national government is formed, a coalition of parties to address the crisis. France is slower to feel the effects, but instability grows. Governments change frequently. No lasting solutions appear. Austria and Hungary face bank collapses. Kreditanstalt, a major Austrian bank, fails in May 1931. It sends shockwaves through European finance. In the Soviet Union, the depression barely registers. Why? Because it is cut off from global markets. Instead, it is enduring its own catastrophe. The first five-year plan continues. Rapid industrialization, forced collectivization, millions of peasants resist. They are labeled kulaks, enemies of the state. Grain is seized, famine follows. In Ukraine, the Holodomor kills millions. It is 1932, and Stalin does not stop. The Soviet economy grows, but at immense human cost. In Latin America, exports fall. Coffee, sugar, copper, demand dries up. In Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, unemployment and political instability spread. Some countries turn to military regimes, others to nationalism. The old liberal order begins to fade. In Canada, economic collapse hits hard, especially in the prairies. The Dust Bowl exacerbates hardship, wind, drought, failed crops, the unemployment rate nears 30%, public works programs begin, but recovery is slow. In Australia, high debt and falling exports lead to default, mass protests erupt, governments collapse, wage cuts deepen the crisis. Meanwhile, in Japan, the crisis strengthens militarist voices, civilian leaders are blamed, the army gains power. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, a puppet state, Manchukuo, is established, the League of Nations condemns the action, Japan leaves the League in 1933, aggression goes unchecked. In China, Chiang Kai-shek continues to fight warlords, and the rising Chinese Communist Party, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, adds a new dimension to the conflict, national unity weakens, the countryside suffers. In India, the Great Depression impacts agriculture, prices for cotton and grain fall, British colonial rule continues, but resistance grows. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi launches the Salt March, a peaceful protest against British salt taxes. Tens of thousands join, the world watches, the depression fuels the call for independence. As conditions worsen globally, the ideals of liberal democracy begin to erode. In Germany, economic collapse empowers extremists. In Italy, Mussolini tightens control. In Japan, military nationalism surges. In the United States, public anger rises. The 1932 election arrives. Franklin Delano Roosevelt defeats Hoover. He promises a New Deal, relief, recovery, reform, hope begins to flicker, but as 1933 begins, the depression is not over, it is deepening, governments fall, empires tremble, ideologies radicalize, certainty collapses, and the world drifts toward conflict. We begin, in Germany. The year is 1933, the Weimar Republic is in crisis, unemployment is above 6 million, street violence between communists and Nazis is routine, the Reichstag is deadlocked. On January 30, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appoints Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. It is meant as a compromise, a containment, it becomes a transformation. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire occurs, February 27, blamed on communists, the Reichstag fire decree follows, it suspends civil liberties, arrests begin, censorship intensifies. On March 23, the Enabling Act is passed, it gives Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws, without Reichstag approval. Democracy ends quietly. The Third Reich begins. By 1934, all parties except the Nazis are banned, trade unions are dissolved, press freedom is gone. When Hindenburg dies in August 1934, Hitler merges the offices of President and Chancellor. He becomes Führer. The Night of the Long Knives follows soon after, a purge of potential rivals. Power is now absolute across the border. In Italy, Benito Mussolini consolidates his control. He had risen to power in 1922, but the 1930s deepen his authoritarian hold. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 gains him support from the Catholic Church. In 1935, he invades Ethiopia. The League of Nations condemns the act, but does nothing effective. Italy is sanctioned, but not isolated. In 1936, Italy draws closer to Nazi Germany. The Rome-Berlin axis is born, a dangerous alignment begins. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin rules with a cold iron grip. The Great Purge begins in 1936. It will last until 1938. Old Bolsheviks, military leaders, scientists, teachers, writers, all are accused, many are executed, others vanish into the Gulag. Fear becomes the method of governance. Propaganda hails Stalin. as the father of nations, the wise leader. The great helmsman, descent is impossible. In Spain, the fragile Second Republic faces instability. In 1936, a military coup sparks a civil war. On one side, the Republicans, a mix of socialists, liberals, anarchists. On the other, the nationalists, led by Francisco Franco. Germany and Italy support the nationalists. The Soviet Union aids the Republicans. Democracies stand aside. The war becomes a proving ground for fascist weaponry. Bombings, like Guernica, stun the world. By 1939, Franco wins. Spain becomes a dictatorship. It will last until 1975. Elsewhere, in Japan, military leaders gain dominance. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria. Now, it looks toward China. In 1937, full-scale war breaks out. The Second Sino-Japanese War begins. The rape of Nanking shocks the world. Civilians massacred. Systematic atrocities. International response is muted. Japan continues its expansion. At the same time, in Germany, rearmament begins. Despite the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler increases military spending. The Luftwaffe is created. The army grows. Factories hum with purpose. In 1935, conscription is reintroduced. The Western powers protest, but do not act. In 1936, Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland. It is a violation of Versailles. French troops could have stopped it. They do nothing. The move emboldens Hitler. In 1936, the Anti-Comintern Pact is signed. Germany and Japan, Italy joins later. An axis begins to form, a new world order. In shadow, inside Germany, oppression intensifies. Jews are targeted. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws are enacted. Jews lose citizenship. Intermarriage is banned. Anti-Semitic propaganda floods society. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, occurs in November 1938. Synagogues burned. Jewish businesses destroyed. Thousands arrested. The message is clear. There is no place for Jews in Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, Austria is next. In March 1938, Germany annexes Austria. The Anschluss. It is swift and bloodless, and welcomed by many Austrians. The Allies, again, do nothing. Later that year, Hitler eyes the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, leaders meet in Munich. Neville Chamberlain of Britain, Edouard Daladier of France, Mussolini, and Hitler. Czechoslovakia is not present. They agree to Hitler's demands. It is called the Munich Agreement. Peace, for our time, says Chamberlain. By March 1939, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. The lie of appeasement is exposed. The world begins to wake. Britain and France guarantee Poland's independence, but it is too late. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement, with a secret clause. They will divide Poland. The countdown begins. As the 1930s end, the ascent is complete. Totalitarian regimes rule across continents. Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, the Soviet Union. Liberal democracies seem weak, disjointed, reactive. The forces of authoritarianism have seized the moment. The world stands on the edge. On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invades Poland. The attack is swift, a military strategy known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, is used. Tanks, planes, infantry, moving together, fast, overwhelming. Polish resistance crumbles. On the 3rd of September, Britain and France declare war on Germany. The Second World War has begun, but there is no immediate fighting in the West. For months, nothing happens. This strange period becomes known as the Phony War, the Sitzkrieg, quiet, waiting, dread. In the east, the Soviet Union moves. On September 17, Soviet forces enter eastern Poland. As agreed in the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland is divided. Soon after, the Soviet Union also invades the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, forcing them into submission. In November 1939, the Soviets attack Finland. The Winter War begins. Despite Soviet numerical superiority, the Finnish resist fiercely. Ski troops, guerrilla tactics, snow. But by March 1940, Finland is forced to cede territory. The Soviet army is exposed as ill-prepared and poorly led. Meanwhile, Germany consolidates power. In April 1940, Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Denmark capitulates within hours. Norway resists longer, but falls. The goal is to secure iron ore shipments and control the North Sea. In May 1940, Germany strikes west. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg are attacked. The Maginot Line, France's line of defense, is bypassed through the Ardennes forest. The French are caught off guard. The British Expeditionary Force, alongside French troops, is pushed back to Dunkirk. From late May to early June, a desperate evacuation takes place. Operation Dynamo, over 300,000 soldiers are rescued by a flotilla of military and civilian vessels, but France is collapsing. On June 10, Italy declares war on France and Britain. On June 14, German troops enter Paris. By June 22, France signs an armistice. The country is divided. The north is occupied. The south becomes Vichy France, a puppet regime under Marshal Philippe Pétain. In just 6 weeks, Western Europe is under Nazi control. Only Britain remains. Germany prepares for an invasion, Operation Sea Lion. But first, air superiority is needed. The Battle of Britain begins in July 1940. The Luftwaffe bombs British airfields, radar stations, and cities. The British Royal Air Force resists fiercely. Radar, Spitfires, Hurricanes, Fighter Command. In September 1940, the Blitz begins. London and other cities are bombed nightly, but Britain does not break. The invasion is postponed, then abandoned. Churchill's resolve keeps Britain in the war. Across the ocean, the United States remains officially neutral, but support increases. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act is passed. Military aid flows to Britain, and later to the Soviet Union. Material, not soldiers. For now. Meanwhile, Germany turns south. In the Balkans, Italy struggles in Greece. In October 1940, Italian forces invade Greece from Albania. They are repelled. Germany intervenes. In April 1941, Germany invades Yugoslavia and Greece. Both fall within weeks. By May, Crete is attacked, in a massive airborne invasion. German paratroopers suffer heavy losses, but capture the island. With the Balkans secured, Germany prepares for its next move. An ideological war, a war of annihilation, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It begins on June 22, 1941. 3 army groups, north, toward Leningrad, center, toward Moscow, south, toward Ukraine. 3 million German troops, supported by tanks, planes, and allies. The Soviets are caught off guard. Massive encirclements, hundreds of thousands captured, cities fall. But the distances are vast, the roads poor, the resistance grows. In the north, Leningrad is surrounded. The siege of Leningrad begins. It will last 872 days. In the center, the advance toward Moscow slows in autumn rains, Rasputitsa, and later snow. In the south, Kiev falls, but Soviet industry is relocated beyond the Urals. On December 5, 1941, German forces reach the outskirts of Moscow. Temperatures drop below -40 degrees Celsius. Frostbite, mechanical failure, fatigue. On December 6, a Soviet counteroffensive begins. Fresh troops from Siberia, released after Japan's decision not to attack the USSR, push the Germans back. It is the first major defeat for the Wehrmacht. The myth of invincibility is broken 1 day later. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. The United States enters the war. The conflict becomes global. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, the United States declares war on Japan. Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. On December 11, the war is now global. Battles rage in Europe, Africa, Asia, and across the vast Pacific Ocean. In the Pacific Theater, Japan advances rapidly. They capture Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines. American and Filipino troops retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. They hold out for months. In April 1942, Bataan falls. Tens of thousands are forced on a brutal march, the Bataan Death March. Thousands die of hunger, disease, and abuse. Corregidor falls in May. The Philippines are lost. But resistance stiffens. On April 18, 1942, the Doolittle raid strikes Tokyo. Minimal damage, but a major morale boost. Japan turns toward expansion in the South Pacific. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea occurs. It is the first naval battle, where opposing ships never see each other. Aircraft carriers dominate. Both sides suffer damage, but Japan's advance toward Port Moresby is halted. In June 1942, comes the turning point, the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers learn of Japanese plans. U.S. carriers ambush the Japanese fleet. For Japanese carriers are sunk. The Imperial Navy is crippled. From this point, Japan is on the defensive. Meanwhile, in the North African desert, Rommel's Africa Corps pushes east. The goal, the Suez Canal, and Middle Eastern oil. But British forces resist. In October 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein begins. General Bernard Montgomery leads the British Eighth Army. The battle lasts for days. Eventually, the Axis lines break. Rommel retreats west. Simultaneously, American forces land in North Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942, U.S. and British troops land in Morocco and Algeria. The Vichy French resist briefly, then surrender. Axis forces are caught in a pincer. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, the United States declares war on Japan. Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. On December 11, the war is now global. Battles rage in Europe, Africa, Asia, and across the vast Pacific Ocean. In the Pacific Theater, Japan advances rapidly. They capture Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines. American and Filipino troops retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. They hold out for months. In April 1942, Bataan falls. Tens of thousands are forced on a brutal march, the Bataan Death March. Thousands die of hunger, disease, and abuse. Corregidor falls in May. The Philippines are lost. But resistance stiffens. On April 18, 1942, the Doolittle raid strikes Tokyo. Minimal damage, but a major morale boost. Japan turns toward expansion in the South Pacific. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea occurs. It is the first naval battle, where opposing ships never see each other. Aircraft carriers dominate. Both sides suffer damage, but Japan's advance toward Port Moresby is halted. In June 1942, comes the turning point, the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers learn of Japanese plans. U.S. carriers ambush the Japanese fleet. For Japanese carriers are sunk. The Imperial Navy is crippled. From this point, Japan is on the defensive. Meanwhile, in the North African desert, Rommel's Africa Corps pushes east. The goal, the Suez Canal, and Middle Eastern oil, but British forces resist. In October 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein begins. General Bernard Montgomery leads the British Eighth Army. The battle lasts for days. Eventually, the Axis lines break. Rommel retreats west. Simultaneously, American forces land in North Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942, U.S. and British troops land in Morocco and Algeria. The Vichy French resist briefly, then surrender. Axis forces are caught in a pincer. By May 1943, they are pushed out of Africa. Europe watches, as the Allies prepare to strike the continent, but in the east, the largest land battles unfold. The German invasion of the Soviet Union continues through 1942. In the south, Germany targets the Caucasus oil fields, and the city of Stalingrad. Operation Blue begins. In August 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad commences. Urban warfare, building by building, room by room, brutal, frozen, relentless, Soviet forces cling to the Volga River. They refuse to surrender. In November 1942, the Soviets launch Operation Uranus. They encircle the German Sixth Army. Hitler refuses retreat. By February 1943, the Germans surrender. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops lost. It is the turning point on the Eastern Front. The German advance is permanently halted. On the home fronts, total war, factories retooled, rationing enforced, propaganda spreads. In Germany, labor is forced. In the Soviet Union, entire industries are relocated. In the United States, production surges. Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, B-17 bombers. Women join the workforce. The Rosie the Riveter era begins. Across the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic intensifies. German U-boats sink Allied convoys. The goal, cut Britain off from supplies. In 1942, Allied shipping losses are high, but technology evolves. Radar, sonar, escort carriers. By mid-1943, Allied convoys regain control. In the air, strategic bombing escalates. The Allies target German industry, day and night. B-17s, Lancasters, cities burn, factories slow, civilians suffer. Debates arise over the morality, but the bombings continue. In the Pacific, Allied forces begin island hopping. The goal, bypass heavily fortified islands and move closer to Japan. In August 1942, the first major offensive begins. Guadalcanal, jungle, mud, malaria. The fighting is brutal. Airfields change hands repeatedly. By February 1943, Japan evacuates. Guadalcanal is secure. From here, the Allies push west. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, each island, a stepping stone, each battle, a bloodbath. Japanese troops rarely surrender. Back in Europe, Allied planners debate the next move. Stalin urges a second front in the west. But first, Italy. In July 1943, the Allies invade Sicily. Operation Husky. The island falls quickly. In September, they land on the Italian mainland. Mussolini is overthrown. Italy signs an armistice, but German troops occupy the country. Fighting continues. The mountainous terrain favors the defenders. Battles rage at Monte Cassino, Anzio, Salerno. Progress is slow. Rome will not fall until 1944. Meanwhile, the Holocaust intensifies. In early 1942, the Wannsee Conference outlines the final solution: mass deportations, extermination camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, millions murdered, Jews, Roma, Poles, Soviet POWs. The full horror is not yet known in the West, but resistance grows. In Warsaw, in 1943. A ghetto uprising. Outnumbered, outgunned, the fighters resist for nearly a month. They are crushed, but their defiance echoes. By the end of 1943, the Axis powers are reeling, Germany loses ground in the east, Italy is fractured, Japan struggles in the Pacific, but the war is far from over. Ahead lie Normandy, Kursk, Leyte Gulf, and the Ardennes. By early 1943, the Axis powers are on the defensive. The Soviet Union reclaims territory lost in 1941 and 1942. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army pushes westward. In July 1943, Germany launches Operation Citadel. The goal is to encircle Soviet forces near Kursk. It becomes the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks, 2 million troops, thousands of aircraft. The Germans attack, but the Soviets are prepared. Fortifications, mines, artillery. After weeks of fighting, the Germans withdraw. It is their last major offensive in the east. From this point, the Soviet advance will be relentless. Cities like Kharkov, Smolensk, and Kiev are liberated in 1943. In the west, Allied forces continue operations in Italy. Fighting is difficult. Mountains, rivers, and German fortifications. In January 1944, the Allies attempt a flanking maneuver at Anzio. The beachhead is established, but German counterattacks delay progress. Only in June 1944 does Rome fall to the Allies. Meanwhile, in the air, bombing campaigns intensify. The goal: destroy German war production, factories, railways, oil refineries. Cities like Hamburg and Berlin are bombed heavily. Thousands of civilians die. In the Pacific, the United States continues island hopping. In November 1943, they attack Tarawa, a small island, but heavily fortified. The battle lasts 3 days. Heavy American losses. Almost all Japanese defenders die. In early 1944, the U.S. captures Kwajalein, Eniwetok, and the Marshall Islands. Naval superiority grows. In June 1944, comes the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Great Marianas. Turkey shoot. Japanese air power is decimated. The way is clear to invade the Mariana Islands. The U.S. captures Saipan in July. It brings Japan within range of B-29 bombers. Air raids on the Japanese mainland begin. Back in Europe, the Allies prepare for a massive invasion, Operation Overlord, the opening of the Western Front. The invasion is planned for June 6, 1944, D-Day. More than 150,000 troops cross the English Channel. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The landings begin under cover of darkness. Paratroopers drop behind enemy lines. At dawn, naval bombardment, followed by the main assault. The fighting at Omaha Beach is especially fierce. Machine gun fire, mines, barbed wire. But by nightfall, the beachheads are secured. The Allies begin their push inland. In the following weeks, the Allies liberate Cherbourg, Caen, and other key towns. German resistance is strong. The hedgerows of Normandy slow progress. But eventually, a breakout occurs, Operation Cobra. U.S. forces push south. British and Canadian troops move east. In August 1944, Paris is liberated. The German army retreats. Also in August, Operation Dragoon, an Allied landing in southern France. Within weeks, most of France is liberated. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union advances on all fronts. In Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, the Red Army destroys Army Group Center. By August, Soviet troops reach Warsaw, but they halt. The Warsaw Uprising begins. Led by the Polish Home Army, they fight the Germans for over 2 months. They receive little support. Eventually, they are crushed. The city is destroyed. In the Balkans, Soviet and local partisan forces liberate Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. Germany's allies in the region switch sides. In September 1944, the Allies launch Operation Market Garden. an ambitious plan to capture bridges. In the Netherlands, paratroopers land at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. The operation fails to achieve all its objectives. Arnhem proves too far. Back in the Pacific, the U.S. retakes the Philippines. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur returns. I have returned. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ensues. The largest naval battle in history, the Japanese Navy is decisively defeated. Kamikaze attacks begin in earnest. Desperate measures, suicide pilots, explosive-laden planes. By late 1944, Japan's capacity to wage war is diminished. Back in Europe, Germany prepares a final gamble. In December 1944, they launched the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. A surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. Initial success, snow, fog, confusion, but Allied lines hold. Bastogne is surrounded. The 101st Airborne refuses to surrender. General Patton's forces relieve them. By January 1945, the Germans are pushed back, their last reserve spent. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets cross into Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In January 1945, they liberate Auschwitz. The scale of the Holocaust becomes known. Death camps, gas chambers, crematoria. The world begins to grasp the full horror. As 1944 ends, the Axis powers face collapse. In the West, the Allies stand at the Rhine River. In the East, the Soviets near Berlin. The end is in sight. As 1945 begins, the Axis powers are crumbling. In the East, the Soviet Red Army launches its winter offensive. On January 12, they strike along the Vistula River. Within weeks, they overrun Warsaw, enter Prussia, and advance deep into Germany. Cities fall, German lines collapse. In the West, the Allies recover from the Battle of the Bulge. They regroup and resume their drive into Germany. In March, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen is captured, a rare intact bridge across the Rhine River. It allows Allied troops to cross into Western Germany. Patton's Third Army races eastward. Meanwhile, the Soviets tighten their grip. They capture Budapest in February. After a brutal siege, they enter Austria and approach Vienna. The German military is exhausted, fuel is scarce, ammunition is low, morale has collapsed. In the air, Allied bombers continue their relentless campaign. In February 1945, the city of Dresden is bombed. Firestorms engulf the city. Tens of thousands perish. The goal remains the same: break German resistance and cripple its war-making capacity. In early 1945, the Yalta Conference takes place. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet. They discuss the post-war world, the division of Germany, the formation of the United Nations. They agree the Soviet Union will enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. As March turns to April, the Allies move deeper into Germany. On April 4th, Leipzig falls. On April 11th, Buchenwald concentration camp is liberated. American soldiers witness the horrors firsthand. In the East, the Soviets close in on Berlin. On April 16th, they launch their final assault. Over 2 million troops, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. German forces are outnumbered, street by street, block by block. The Soviets fight their way into the capital. Civilians hide in basements, buildings collapse, smoke fills the skies. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. He names Karl Donitz his successor. By May 2nd, Berlin falls. German forces begin to surrender. On May 7th, in Reims, France, Germany unconditionally surrenders to the Western Allies. On May 8th, the surrender is ratified in Berlin. Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. Celebrations erupt. The war in Europe is over, but the war in the Pacific continues. The Japanese military refuses to surrender. In April 1945, U.S. forces land on Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific Theater, fierce. Resistance, caves, tunnels, kamikaze attacks. The Battle of Okinawa lasts nearly 3 months, casualties are staggering, over 12,000 American deaths, over 100,000 Japanese. Tens of thousands of civilians perish. Meanwhile, Franklin D. Roosevelt dies on April 12. Harry S. Truman becomes President of the United States. He is briefed on a secret project, the Manhattan Project, a plan to develop atomic weapons. On July 16, the first successful test is conducted in New Mexico, a new, terrifying weapon. At the Potsdam Conference in July, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin issue an ultimatum to Japan: surrender unconditionally, or face destruction. Japan does not respond. On August 6, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. A single explosion kills over 70,000 instantly. Fires rage, buildings vanish, radiation spreads. Still, no surrender. On August 9, a second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. Over 40,000 perish. That same day, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria, defeating Japanese forces in days. Finally, on August 15, Japan announces its surrender. VJ Day, victory over Japan. On September 2, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signs the formal instrument of surrender. World War II is over. The deadliest conflict in human history has ended. Over 60 million lives lost, nations devastated, borders redrawn, new powers emerge. The United States and the Soviet Union stand as global superpowers. But peace is fragile. A new conflict begins to take shape, not with armies, but with ideology. Capitalism versus communism. The Cold War begins. But that is another story.